Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal Venerable. See playlist for other chapters and novels. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 2241, Chase. After the butterflies had fully enveloped Zen, the strapping man looked away arrogantly. His name was Arvin and he was one of the Warden race's strongest warriors. The battle with the invaders was led by him, Bonnie and Bergen. The original plan had actually been slightly different. Burge and Bonnie would lead their clansmen to outflank the intruders from the left and right and cut off their retreat. Afterwards, Bonnie was to control the azure blue trapping butterflies to finish them off. However, just when the two sides started to fight, Zen had rushed up alone to stop Arvin, which interrupted their plan. After being sure that Zen was going to die, Arvin turned his thoughts to the situation ahead. He shouldn't have wasted his time on this young man. But just as he turned his eyes away, a green light flashed in the corner of his eyes. Zen's truth crystal turned the sword green again. Facing the approaching butterflies, Zen narrowed his eyes and gently shook the long sword in his hand. Crack! The green sword tip touched a butterfly. With a crisp sound, the azure blue butterfly exploded and disappeared. After killing the first butterfly, Zen drew back his long sword and continued hitting the other butterflies, moving on to the next target as soon as he had killed one. Crack! 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 In the blink of an eye, all the butterflies that were charging at Zen were blown up by his sword. When the barrier of butterflies formed a crack, Zen rushed out, heading straight towards Arvin. What the? Arvin was stunned by the sight in front of him. In the blink of an eye, Zen's long sword had come straight towards his face. Arvin's reaction was equally fast. He swiftly took a few steps back, dodging the sword with lightning-fast reflexes. Swish! Zen's sword still managed to graze him on the forehead, leaving a shallow wound that trickled blood. There was no way Zen was going to let go of this opportunity. Since he missed his target at the first try, he immediately thrust out his sword again. When Arvin looked at Zen's sword radiance, fear appeared in his eyes. This was a life and death situation. If he allowed himself to let his guard down, he could get killed by Zen's sword. He gritted his teeth and waved both of his hands. A string of butterflies flew out from his fingers, flashing blue light. Crack! 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 Zen had no choice but to use his sword to blow up these butterflies. Because of this, he had to slow down his speed in chasing after Arvin, which gave Arvin some breathing space. In spite of this, Zen was still in hot pursuit after Arvin. The two soon reached the middle of the street. It was the site where the people of the Warden race were fighting against the exiles and wild gods. Pew! A black light roared and pierced the leg of a member of the Warden race. The man in black robe rolled down the roof and fell to the ground. Go! Go! A few wild gods rushed forward. With a long halberd in his hand, the wild god in the lead jumped up and nailed the falling man to the ground. The rest of the wild gods held all kinds of weapons in their hands and attacked the man mercilessly. In just a flash, the black-robed man of the Warden race was dismembered into pieces. On the other side of the roof, just as three exiles jumped up and barely had time to stand firmly on their feet, three blue lights flashed in front of them. The three flying knives made from the azure blue energy all stabbed into their chests simultaneously. In the near distance, the eyes of a brown-haired woman were cold, with azure blue flying knives in her hand fanned out neatly. Shatter! The woman said. The flying knives lodged in the three exiles' chests cracked into countless tiny pieces, spreading out from their chests. These pieces were said to be invincible. In an instant, they had seriously injured the internal organs of the three exiles. The cold-eyed woman was Bonnie Lu from the Warden race. She was heartbroken seeing the people of her race die one after another. It was difficult for her to accept such a tragic scene. The Warden race lived a peaceful life in this space and was in harmony with the rest of the world. The only battle in their history was a civil war between the Free faction and the Conservative faction, but it was nowhere as miserable as the battle currently raging in front of her eyes. After all, this battle was related to the life and death of the Warden race. Just as Bonnie was about to attack again, she suddenly heard a gust of wind. The look on her face changed immediately. She lowered her head and turned around. Swoosh! A saber passed behind her. If her response had been a bit slower, she would have been trapped by the saber, and her body would probably have gotten split into two. After successfully avoiding the saber, she waved the blue flying knives out of her hand. Emily stood right behind Bonnie, her eyes deadly calm. She twisted her body slightly and tried to get through the gap between the flying knives to kill Bonnie. Emily had rich combat experience. Even if she lost her cultivation base, she could still use the conditions to her advantage. She wasn't going to give Bonnie a chance to escape. However, as the flying knives shot out, Bonnie opened her mouth and cried, "Shatter!" All the flying knives immediately broke into countless blue fragments, blocking Emily's path. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Bonnie quickly distanced herself from Emily. "You are Emily from the snake goddess race," Bonnie said, staring at Emily coldly. The people of the Warden race often disguised themselves when they came to inspect the bone towers, and they were quite familiar with the exiles. Bonnie had never thought that Emily would attack her in secret. What a pity. Emily smiled faintly. The saber, which was stained with blood, spun slightly in her hand. She had just killed 6 black-robed people. Humph. Bonnie raised her hand. The blue light continuously condensed and turned into tiny flying knives once again. Even though she had the grace of the Chaos Ancient God, she was still under great pressure to face Emily. However, it did not mean that she wasn't confident that she could kill Emily. Just as the two were in a stalemate and planning their next moves, a series of strange cracking sounds suddenly came from below and distracted them. They both looked towards the noises. Zen. Emily saw that Zen was chasing after Arvin with a long sword in his hand. More oddly, the long sword in Zen's hand was glowing with a strange energy, which blasted through the butterflies easily. "Brother." Bonnie's face grew pale with worry as she took in the scene. She had thought that Arvin could get rid of Zen quickly, and then come to her aid as soon as possible. She didn't expect that Zen would get this close to Arvin. She was now worried that her brother might be killed by him. Without a second thought, Bonnie turned around and threw several flying knives at Emily. Under the cover of the broken pieces of the flying knives, Bonnie jumped down from the roof and headed towards Arvin. Chapter 2242, Joint Attack from Brother and Sister. After the fragments of the flying knives scattered in all directions, Emily took a few steps back as her eyes stared blankly at Zen. She always had a feeling that Zen had special methods she didn't know about. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to kill the exiles sent by Spark so easily. But what Emily didn't expect was that Zen could break the restrictions of the strength-equalizing Thurgy. The green energy was not very powerful, but when Emily took a quick glance at it, she immediately felt that it was indeed quite mysterious. She really had a hard time seeing through him. After a short pause, she saw that Bonnie was rushing down. She lightly tapped her toe as she prepared herself to jump down from the roof. She didn't want to let Bonnie mess up the situation. But just as Emily jumped up, a blue long whip immediately came after her. Phew, the long whip was very sharp. Its slash created a deep cut on the roof and immediately rushed towards Emily. She frowned as she saw it coming. Of course, she was unable to use her mortal body to withstand the impact. All she could do was to abruptly twist and stay put on the roof. "I am your opponent. Ha ha." Another man in a black robe with a blue long whip in his hand blocked Emily's way. Zen's speed at brandishing his sword became faster and faster as he struck his targets more precisely every time. Although Arvin summoned a lot of butterflies in a ridiculous manner, it was all in vain. As soon as the butterflies were condensed, they were immediately destroyed by the tip of Zen's sword. His precision with every strike was truly astonishing. It was as if his sword was a part of his hand. He used it with finesse and he could do whatever he wanted with it. What an amazing display of swordsmanship. How could someone like you exist? Arvin thought to himself. In his opinion, there were only a few leaders from the exiles that he shouldn't mess, and those were Timotheus and Emily and the like. They were very powerful, but they were nothing under the influence of strength-equalizing Thurgy. On the other hand, they knew they were destined to stop the intruders with all that they had. After all, they were lucky enough to receive the grace of their master. But now a brat suddenly popped out, and no one understood what kind of method he used to surpass the restrictions of the strength-equalizing Thurgy. They didn't know what was going on. Arvin had a lot of questions running through his head, but he didn't have the chance to ask. All he wanted was to survive. Seeing that Zen was getting closer and closer to him, he couldn't think of a better way to stop him. The brat's sword was like a black hole that violently sucked him. He couldn't get rid of it no matter how hard he tried. Phew, Zen was finally in front of Arvin. He then raised his sword to strike. As he struck with his sword, the emerald green sword radiance appeared. Die. Zen was so close to Arvin that there was no way for him to avoid his strike. Arvin's heart sank as he realized that he was about to lose his precious life. As he waited for his inevitable death with his eyes closed, whoosh, 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 3 whistling sounds echoed through his ears. 3 blue flying knives flew past his head and ears and went straight for Zen. Zen wasn't willing to let go of his opportunity to kill Arvin. He saw the 3 flying knives coming towards him, but he didn't want to give in. Ding! Zen slashed across the flying knives with his long sword. After he broke the first flying knife, the long sword immediately went for Arvin's head. But the other 2 flying knives cracked at that moment and countless tiny blue fragments scattered all over the place. If Zen didn't dodge, he would have been severely injured by the densely packed fragments. Dang it! In the end, Zen had no other choice but to draw back his sword and step back to prevent the fragments from hurting him. Arvin was finally able to get out of Zen's hot pursuit. With a bit of luck, he managed to escape his death. Puff, puff. Arvin was very exhausted, his heart beating fast as he gasped for air. Arvin, are you feeling all right? Bonnie came up to Arvin and stood beside him. I'm all right. If it wasn't for your help, I would have been dead by now, said Arvin. He was ecstatic that he had a narrow escape from death. What happened to him? The green energy on his sword. Where is it coming from? Bonnie looked at Zen, who wasn't very far from them, and her eyes were immediately filled with confusion. Her brothers, trapping butterflies, and her, cracking knives, were both graces from their master. Only with these graces could they be qualified to ignore the strength equalizing theurgy. The young man in front of them was extremely unfamiliar, and she thought maybe he wasn't well known in the Bone Towers. How could he have the ability to ignore the restrictions of the strength equalizing theurgy? I am not sure either. Maybe there is something wrong with the strength equalizing theurgy. Arvin didn't believe what came out of his own mouth. The strength equalizing theurgy was given by the master, someone who was undoubtedly extremely powerful. It was impossible for the master to commit such silly mistakes. None of it matters, we just need to kill him together. A murderous look appeared in Bonnie's eyes. The warden race was starting to gain an advantage in the fierce battle between the 2 parties. The other party had lost more wild gods and exiles than the warden race. But what they had to solve as soon as possible were the elites among the intruders. At first, Bonnie decided that Emily was her target. However, when she saw that her brother was in danger, she had to focus on the young man who was standing right in front of her. Zen placed his long sword horizontally on his chest. When he heard the conversation between the 2, a faint light appeared in his eyes. Endless cries and screams echoed through their surroundings. Some of the wild gods and exiles were still being murdered by the warden race. Although Zen was not familiar with those people, they were his comrades and they had fought with him throughout their way. He also knew that he had to finish his battle as soon as possible. Let's go, Bonnie shouted as she sent blue flying knives towards Zen. At the same time, countless butterflies flew out of Arvin's hand. As they fluttered in the air, they immediately followed the path left by the flying knives. The moment Zen saw the joint attack from the brother and sister, he immediately moved his feet slightly to sweep his body to the side like a ghost. After circling around them, he found an opening and rushed towards his 2 opponents. Arvin and Bonnie executed their attacks perfectly. The 2 of them unhurriedly kept a proper distance from each other, and at the same time, they also formed a 2-pronged attack. If Zen rushed towards Arvin, he would be vulnerable to an attack from Bonnie. If he rushed towards Bonnie, he would be vulnerable to an attack from Arvin. As they came closer and closer, the 2 were able to surround Zen. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. He then brandished his long sword as rays of green light formed a protective shield around him. When he saw that he was surrounded by Bonnie and Arvin, he couldn't think of any way to escape. Bonnie waved his arms constantly to bombard Zen with more flying knives. She glanced up and said with a smile, Bergen, your timing is perfect. Help us kill this brat right now. The battle between Zen and the 2 siblings was starting to attract other people's attention. After all, both Bonnie and Arvin were the core figures of the warden race. But now Bergen was about to join the fight. He knew he had to help them. The warden members couldn't believe what they were seeing. Even Emily didn't deserve them sending so many people to deal with her after the strength equalizing theurgy was activated. Where did this talented swordsman come from? A lot of the warriors who were busy fighting stopped at that moment to see who Zen was. Chapter 2243, 1 against 3. On the other side of the roof, there stood a thin young man. He was Bergen Bai, the one whom Bonnie had called out earlier. In his left hand, he was carrying something like a terrifying trophy, Becker Sau's head. As one of the exiles in the fire-melting race, Becker Sau had been as significant in his race as Emily was in the snake goddess race, or as Timotheus was in the 9 Li race. Even if the strength equalizing theurgy had worked, he was unquestionably powerful. But somehow, he had not only been defeated but decapitated by Bergen by. In his right hand, Bergen was holding a thick heavy sword. The blue light on the surface of the sword constantly sparkled, emitting a terrifying energy fluctuation. Right now, he was going up against 4 exiles, including the valiant Leopold and Ramsay from the 9 Li race. Now that they had racked up several wounds on their bodies, both Leopold and Ramsay looked at Bergen with vigilance and caution. The once unknown Bergen had now become a formidable enemy in their eyes. After all, the strength Bergen had displayed far exceeded that of the others in black robes. Beckersau had even been killed just because he had underestimated his enemy. Even as Bergen fought with Leopold and Ramsay, he managed to slay more than 10 wild gods and 5 or 6 exiles. During the fight, when he noticed the stir around Zen, he promptly withdrew from the battle and rushed toward the other side. "Really, Bonnie, are you asking me for help?" Bergen asked as he looked down from the roof. Among the younger generation of the Warden race, Bonnie and Arvin were the most popular ones. However, in terms of strength, there was a big gap between them and Bergen. The only reason Bergen wasn't popular was because he was remote and arrogant, and not very well liked within his race. Most importantly, the Lu clan was the largest clan in the Warden race, and it was from this clan that the race would choose a leader. Because of this, the relationship between Bergen and the siblings had always been strained. "Cut the garbage. Don't you know what time it is now? Don't you see that he is different from the others?" Bonnie yelled sternly. Right now, the Warden race was fighting a life and death battle. How could Bergen joke around their usual rivalry at a time like this? Bergen took another look at Zen. When he saw the green light constantly flowing on Zen's arm, a hint of surprise flashed in his eyes. "Well, this is interesting. This guy has actually overcome the strength equalizing theurgy." Then, with a cold chuckle, he casually tossed aside the head in his hand and jumped down. As he jumped, the heavy sword in his hand emitted a blue light, forming a wide arc in the air, right toward Zen's head. Zen, who was already busy trying to fend off attacks from Bonnie and Arvin, groaned inwardly. Now that Bergen had joined the battle, he would be under a lot more pressure than before. As he looked at Bergen's sword heading toward him, his body suddenly shrank. At the same time, he cut off Arvin's butterflies and Bonnie's flying knives, and then summoned all his strength and poured it into his blade. Crack! His long sword curved up, colliding with Bergen's heavy sword. Channeling the descent power, Bergen used his sword to hack from top to bottom. It was a formidable blow. Zen raised his long sword and put most of his strength into it. Once his sword touched Bergen's, it became heavier and heavier, cushioning most of the force from Bergen's sword. As soon as Bergen landed, Zen's long sword became crooked. Zen used this force to push Bergen aside by a few steps, buying himself a few seconds to breathe. Zen, what a great swordsmanship! Everyone around them couldn't help but marvel at this scene. If there was no strength equalizing theurgy, what Zen had just done would have been nothing in the eyes of these exiles. But now, they all thought that Zen's skill was amazing. "Let's help Zen. How can we let Zen single-handedly take on 3 of them? Let's stop that brother and sister. How could they allow Zen to face 3 people alone?" But the moment they made a move, several black-robed men from the Warden race rushed up to stop them. Bergen, who had been cleverly forced back by Zen's sword, also looked up at Zen with surprise. "I told you not to be careless. This guy is not easy to deal with," Arvin muttered. "Really?" Bergen asked casually before rushing toward Zen again with the heavy sword on his shoulder. In terms of martial arts skills, Bergen was not as good as Zen. However, he had Bonnie and Arvin fighting alongside him. They could trap Zen like a huge net. Zen would have to tear through this big net first in order to deal with Bergen's sword. In the few seconds after he had managed to force Bergen back a few steps, he had somehow found himself trapped. Seeing this, Leopold, Ramsay, and the exiles from the other races burned with anxiety. They didn't know how Zen had surpassed the limits of the strength equalizing theurgy, but they knew that he might be the only one who could confront the Warden race head-on. Even the powerful Leopold and Ramsay were afraid of the blue energy. After all, the weapons they were using were ordinary and would immediately shatter on contact with the blue energy. There was no way they could get around that disadvantage. Even Emily, who was not far away, felt the same way. Since the Warden race had the Chaos Ancient God's blessing, they had a great advantage in the contest of strength. Zen was the only one who could resist their enemies head-on by relying on the green light. He was their only hope right now. They all badly wanted to help him out of the tough spot that he was in, but they themselves were busy trying to fight off the black-robed men. Both Arvin and Bonnie became calmer. Bonnie's flying knives suddenly turned into a few streaks of light and shot toward Zen's weak points in an almost fatal attack. And although the speed of the butterflies that Arvin had summoned was slow, there were still a large number of them. The trajectory of their flying was unpredictable and hard to guard against. As for Bergen, Arvin and Bonnie had deliberately left just enough of a gap for him to pass through, and from time to time, he would launch a fatal strike at Zen. Zen slowly retreated while he warded off their attacks, but at last, he was forced into a corner. "It's close," Bergen said flatly. At this moment, he no longer looked down on his opponent. Bergen was confident that he would be able to defeat even the most powerful of exiles, but this guy in front of him was able to block attacks from the three of them combined. It was obvious to him that if he fought Zen one-on-one, he would be no match for him. Hearing Bergen's words, Bonnie stretched out both of her hands. Under the condensation of the blue light, more than a dozen flying knives materialized and turned into streaks of light that shot toward Zen. Arvin's eyes flashed as well. His blue butterflies fluttered faster and faster, forming a small storm that flew straight toward Zen. The brother and sister were trying their best to take down their opponent. At the same time, a blue light began to circle the heavy sword in Bergen's hand as he rushed toward Zen. Chapter 2244, The Falling Star Palm. Bergen injected everything that he had into his sword attack. Now that Zen had nowhere to escape, his only option was to deflect the attack as much as he could. His survival was not guaranteed at all. Crack, crack, crack. Zen tried his best to deal with the attacks from Arvin and his sister Bonnie at the same time. Although he seemed calm, he was under a lot of pressure. Seeing that Bergen was approaching with a heavy sword, Zen swung his long sword up and down as fast as he could. After he cut countless butterflies and flying knives, he began to swing the long sword sideways. The tip of his sword went straight towards Bergen's heavy sword. Zen's swordsmanship was still ingenious, but the enemy he was facing then was not just any other warrior from the lower world of the universe. Bergen ignored Zen's sword and went straight for his body. Bang! As soon as Zen's long sword touched the heavy sword, he immediately felt a huge crushing force. He reached out his hand but couldn't hold it any longer. His long sword unexpectedly flew out of his hand and stuck on the ground not far away. Seeing that Zen no longer had his weapon, Bergen no longer hesitated and immediately raised his heavy sword up high to prepare for a strike. At that moment, on the other side of the roof was Emily rushing over as fast as she could. Crack, 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 azure blue whip shadows constantly exploded behind Emily. Seeing that Zen was being driven into a dead end, she gritted her teeth and bypassed the man in black who tried to stop her. She wanted to help Zen as much as she could. Emily was like a swift swallow. She jumped in the air as her extremely soft body tightened like a bow. As her body stretched further, the saber in her hand shot towards Bergen. At the same time on the back side of the street, Timotheus ran wildly with his saber on his shoulder. According to their previous agreement, Timotheus' main responsibilities were to protect Zelda and Luther. So once the battle with the Warden race began, he immediately escorted the two to safety. Just like Emily, Timotheus couldn't bear to see Zen die in that place. He rushed over and threw out the saber in his hand. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The broad saber flew over the heads of the people who were in the middle of a fight before it headed straight for Bergen. Oh, Bergen's eyes blinked as a subtle grin appeared on the corner of his mouth. He raised his hand as he gently waved it backwards. The annular saber that Emily threw at him was broken into two parts in a flash. After he cut off the annular saber, his heavy sword took the chance and was able to hit the huge saber that Timotheus threw hard at him. Clang! The saber was cut in half as it fell down. Such ordinary weapons weren't strong enough to resist the energy attached to his heavy sword at all. It was all thanks to the grace given by the Chaos Ancient God. You are defeating nothing but the air. After saying this, Bergen turned around to face Zen once again. He felt like an executioner who could take Zen's life away if he wanted to. He knew the exiles couldn't do anything to stop him at all. But then again, it was Timotheus of the Nine Li race and Emily of the Snake Goddess race that just tried to rescue Zen from him. They were probably the two most powerful exiles in this world. Since they were so worried about Zen's safety, he must really be of great importance. Now, you will die. No one can save you anymore, Bergen said calmly. Whoosh! On the surface of the heavy sword in his hand were rings of blue light. It seemed that he turned the heavy sword into a long spear and then threw it directly at Zen. If anyone got stabbed by his spear, they were sure to die within seconds. Their bodies would be crushed into tiny pieces by its energy. If you don't make a move right now, you won't stand a chance. Reminded number 9527 on the sclerite at Zen's chest. It couldn't stand it anymore. After Zen condensed the truth crystal with the help of number 9527, he was able to master the most rudimentary move of the truth crystal, which was known as the falling star palm. To be more precise, the falling star palm was not really its most rudimentary move. To directly melt the truth crystal and infuse it into his arm and sword like what Zen did before was the most basic way. Therefore, number 9527 felt somewhat dissatisfied, wondering why Zen did that. But Zen had his own considerations. He had no idea how powerful the Warden race was. If he could deal with them with the power of the truth crystal alone, he wouldn't want to use his trump cards in order to postpone the revelation of his falling star palm. Moreover, the energy of the truth crystal and his martial arts skills were enough all the time. But now, Zen knew that he had no other choice. He couldn't hold back anymore. He raised his head as a square truth crystal appeared. It emitted a dark green light in his palm. As he concentrated his mind, the truth crystal began to rotate slowly. The falling star palm, buzz. In an instant, the truth crystal began to rotate rapidly. At the same time, an identical vortex also appeared above everyone's heads. However, the vortex was 10 times larger and an emerald green light could be seen on it. Swish! The light in the vortex shone brighter, and with a gentle stroke of Zen's hand, it began to fall down. Since the Warden race received the grace of Herbert, they used it superficially. Just like what Zen had done before, they had merely turned this energy into a weapon. It was the original intention of Herbert all along, because the azure blue light summoned by the Warden race couldn't be transformed into any other shape. Sandy's 2 sharp blades, Arvin's trapping butterflies, and Bonnie's flying knives were some of the best examples. Perhaps in Herbert's opinion, the Warden race stood a chance against invaders because of their master's grace. The only person who was capable of changing the shape of the blue energy was Bergen with his heavy sword. However, the number of changes he could do was also limited. Only to a certain extent could he control the energy. He couldn't control it at will or activate and use it in a Thurgy. But Zen had displayed a Thurgy. In order to master the falling star palm, Zen had to spend a lot of time studying it. However, the final power that it produced was a bit of a disappointment to him. According to what number 9527 had said, if its master revealed the falling star palm, thousands of stars would fall. Every star would be so powerful that it could destroy the world within minutes. However, it was currently impossible for Zen to accumulate so many truth crystals and use the technique. A small ray of light wouldn't be enough to kill an ordinary wild god, so it was not ideal at all. That was why Zen chose not to show it to anyone yet. However, after the strength equalizing Thurgy had been used, they all became mortals. The falling star palm was the only Thurgy he could actually show. At that moment, the power of what was once proved useless suddenly became extremely terrifying. The shining star immediately lit up everyone's face. Chapter 2245, Kill Them. As he realized that his saber had been cut straight off, Timotheus' heart sank. Zen's identity was of great importance to the Nine Li race. For this reason, Timotheus didn't want Zen to take too much risk. Hence, he was more willing to protect him. In spite of his will, after the strength equalizing Thurgy had been activated, Zen's performance was outstanding, and persuading him had become a difficult, if not impossible, task. Fortunately for all the warriors involved, Zen had truly displayed his extraordinary talents, and he led everyone safely into the city. Now that they had faced the Warden race, they found themselves trapped in another desperate situation. Had he known what was to come, never would he have brought Zen to this place. Just when Timotheus was at a complete loss and felt like nothing could get any worse, a whirlpool suddenly appeared in the sky above. "This Thurgy," he uttered. The ray of starlight reflected itself in Timotheus' old eyes, now shining with a green hue. After Emily threw her annular saber out, she jumped up into the air and hooked her arm onto a beam of the roof, hanging herself in midair. As she performed this movement, she was very anxious, without a doubt. Although she was extremely powerful, her special skills and Thurgies didn't work to her advantage now. "You must rely on yourself, Zen," Emily thought to herself. She believed in miracles, because the mere process of her growing up was a miracle in and of itself. She knew that Zen could perform his own kind of miracle. And she was right, his results truly didn't disappoint her. Beneath the light, she smiled slightly. Bergen hadn't imagined that Zen would apply this Thurgy whatsoever. To the contrary, he thought that his sword strike would kill Zen directly, seeing as he was standing no more than a foot away from him. The starlight had instead smashed his heavy sword to pieces. Bang! As soon as the starlight hit Bergen's heavy sword, the vast amount of blue energy spread quickly and the sword broke in an instant. Bergen's right hand that held the heavy sword also let out a crisp snapping sound. He hadn't had any time to withdraw his hand from the sword hilt. Under the great pressure from the huge force, his arm broke. Once the starlight had effectively smashed the heavy sword, it crashed to the ground, forming a black crater the size of a watermelon. The deep, dark crater appeared bottomless. As he watched what was going on, Bergen fell into a daze. Adrenaline rushed through him to such an extent that he completely forgot the pain from the broken bone in his arm. Who do you think is going to come save you now? Zen stared at Bergen coldly and smiled, raising his right hand above his head again. Another truth crystal was condensed and began rotating. It quickly picked up speed. Simultaneously, a second green whirlpool appeared in the sky, and a little star was produced from the latter. Realizing that the situation wasn't good, Bergen didn't hesitate a second more and retreated quickly. Despite his quick act, it was already too late. The star began falling fast. If they hadn't been deprived of their cultivation by the strength-equalizing Thurgi, they would have been able to dodge the falling star. With his physical body's current state though, it was simply impossible for Bergen to escape. Bang! The starlight smashed down onto him and crushed half of his shoulder. By the time it had fallen to the ground and exploded, it had devoured his entire body. Bergen died on the spot. Arvin and Bonnie weren't far away. Both of their faces were full of panic at the scene that played out before them. Furthermore, their undulating chests indicated their great unease. Sure, they were always on bad terms with Bergen, but they were still very sad to see Bergen die in such a miserable manner. More importantly, even Bergen had been killed by Zen. Who was ever going to stop Zen now? For their race, there was just no way back now. Arvin and Bonnie were leaders. Even if they knew that they were no match for Zen, they still couldn't retreat or run away. They had no choice but to show themselves confidence. Arvin, determination flashed in Bonnie's eyes. She wasn't ready or willing to give up. Arvin nodded back in response. Before the battle had even begun, they had already made up their minds that they would fight to the end. It didn't matter if they had to risk their lives or even die. Even now, the Warden race still had chances of pulling through. As long as they could kill Zen in front of them, they were willing to risk their lives in order to perish together along with him. Whoosh, whoosh, Arvin and Bonnie began running in circles around Zen, while pushing the blue energy to its extreme. Swish, 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 Bonnie was now running at full speed. The flying knives drew thin white lines in the air as they came straight for Zen. Zen had just recently broken away from the cage that they had created. How could he possibly repeat the same mistake? Out of the blue, he jumped to the right and charged toward Bonnie. Bonnie, also watching what was happening, Arvin was in great shock. As he rushed over to Bonnie, he controlled the butterflies in order to make them surround Zen once again. Zen quickly ran over to the long sword inserted by the roadside and picked it up. As the green light flashed, Zen quickly bombed the butterflies outward, and the distance separating him and Bonnie quickly decreased. Gritting her teeth, Bonnie became ruthless. Instead of retreating, she confronted Zen with might. Shatter! She charged toward Zen and the flying knives in her hand exploded at the same time. They formed a jumble of fragments that covered him in an instant. If Zen were to be hit by one of these fragments, his whole body would be beaten to pieces. Arvin, who crept in from behind Zen, also summoned a large number of butterflies, once again forming a siege. This time, Zen didn't hesitate at all, not even for a split second. He stopped straight in his tracks as he reached out his hand and flicked it. Phew! A starlight zipped toward Arvin. Arvin had witnessed the green starlight's power before. When he saw Zen casually moving his hand in this way, his heart skipped a beat and he immediately jumped backward. He knew what was coming. Fortunately for him, he succeeded in avoiding the falling starlight. Despite such, just as he avoided the starlight, a flying knife as thin as a cicada's wing zoomed straight at him, slicing through the air with grace. Before Arvin could even land back on the ground, his neck was cut by the flying knife. Blood began spurting from his neck, and he knelt down, covering his wound with both his hands and rolling on the ground. To a mortal's body, this kind of injury was generally fatal. Arvin, Bonnie cried, her young face twisting in sadness. Her pain was obvious to all. In a heartfelt rage, Bonnie rushed toward Zen with 2 flying knives in her hands. She was ready to take her revenge. She, of course, was no match for Zen, especially not in such a close combat. Zen waved his sword in the air several times, causing the flying knives in Bonnie's hand to break into pieces. At last, he stabbed his sword directly between her eyebrows. "I'm sorry," he spat as he performed his final attack. Bonnie was courting her death. In both Bonnie's and Arvin's eyes, Zen saw nothing but helplessness. Zen's goal was opposite to theirs, and thus, his only resort was to kill them both. There was no right or wrong in this battle. Once Zen had killed Bonnie, Arvin and Bergen all in a row, the Warden race's situation changed drastically. These three warriors were the leaders of the three Warden race teams. As they died one after the next in such quick succession, the Warden race's morale had greatly decreased. No one was willing to fight anymore. It didn't take long before the people wearing black robes fled in disarray. A few of them were even killed in all the chaos. The few of them who struggled really hard were quickly surrounded and killed. After a while, the area quieted down once more, leaving nothing but a strong, disheartening smell of blood. Chapter 2246, The Final Resistance. Emily bent down and ripped a piece of cloth from a corpse. She bound it around her shoulder wound. Moments ago, she had been hit by an arrow and a serrated wound was left bleeding on her shoulder. In the past, she would have been capable of recovering from this kind of injury in the blink of an eye. In fact, there wasn't any need to deal with such a basic gash. Now, on the other hand, such a wound could easily lead to her death. After dressing her wound, Emily jumped down from the rooftop. The other exiles as well as the surviving wild gods also moved in order to gather around Zen. Zelda and Luther, who were still under protection, both followed quickly behind, too. The battle just now was too violent. At least 3/4 of wild gods had died, while nearly half of the exiles had been executed. That said, an approximate 200 members of the Warden race had also been killed. In the pits of their stomachs, everyone had the feeling of having survived a disaster. Their expressions quickly changed as they glanced toward Zen again. If Zen hadn't fought Bonnie, Arvin and Bergen of the Warden race on his own, the battle's results would have been hard to determine. After all, one couldn't forget that Bergen alone had the capacities to fight against several exiles of high power, including Ramsay and Leopold. Furthermore, Zen had blocked Arvin from the very beginning. If Arvin really employed all of his strength and cooperated with the other men in black robes, it was highly possible that the situation would become worse. By that time, all members of Zen's group would have been dead. Clap. Emily patted Zen on the shoulder heavily and said with a smile, although I've probably guessed quite a bit, I wouldn't have expected this little guy to hide his skill so well. Zen could somehow employ such a powerful Thurgy under the effect of the strength-equalizing Thurgy, which was unbelievable. Timotheus followed the others and looked as though he was lost deep in his thoughts. With a wry smile, he said, even I couldn't discover that, not to mention you, Emily. In fact, Timotheus had already figured it all out. The strength-equalizing Thurgy was created by the Chaos Ancient God. The rule he had set simply couldn't be violated by a nobody like Zen. Zen, on his behalf, had such powerful might because of his blood. His Thurgy was most likely the Chaos Ancient God's bloodline Thurgy. Thus, he could easily break another Chaos Ancient God's rule and get rid of the strength-equalizing Thurgy's restriction. This was something that Timotheus had understood and he wasn't willing to discuss the matter. Timotheus was pleased to note that Zen had the capacities to lead them all forward. He felt very content. So much so, in fact, that he even felt no matter how bad the situation for the Nine Li race was in the Source world, as long as Zen was present, they still had a glimmer of hope. If he could leave this place, he'd try his best to follow and support Zen. Many of the warriors had been seriously injured in this last battle, and more than 10 of them had lost their arms or legs. The badly injured warriors who were unable to fight had no choice but to stay where they were. At least for now. If they could at least get rid of the strength-equalizing Thurgy, those who had lost their limbs would have the capacity to grow them back in a very short period of time. Emily and a few of the other warriors were also injured, but nothing too serious. They could take a little ordinary medicine for treatment in order to heal from their wounds. The treatment effects were naturally very ordinary, and for this reason, they chose not to move forward immediately but to recuperate instead. Arvin, Bonnie, and Bergen are the backbone of the conservative faction. The rest of them won't make a move on their own, and they will definitely guard the equality altar. There's no need to be afraid, Zelda encouraged, looking into Zen's eyes. She continued, and best of all, we still have Zen. At the very beginning of it all, Zelda had only hoped that Zen would help her get revenge by taking advantage of the exiles. Zen becoming a killer had never once crossed her mind. Unbelievably, these powerful exiles were pinning their hopes on Zen. It seems that we've nearly succeeded. An exile shouted. Do you think we can finally go back to the Source world? We must be sure to thank Zen this time. The eyes of the exiles lit up, and their hope had been sparked. Success was at the tip of their fingers. Inevitably, they felt a little excited. As Zelda looked at the corpses lying on the ground in all directions, a hint of sadness appeared in her eyes. She was the one who had caused this war. She was, to say the least, the traitor of the Warden race. The disputes between the conservative faction and the free faction were something she had never wanted to see, or ever be a part of. However, as she thought of her parents who had been murdered, the sadness in her eyes gradually faded away. Perhaps she had been destined to suffer through this all. After resting for an entire day, the group continued moving forward together. In fact, the location where they fought with the Warden race was very close to the Equality Altar. Approximately an 8-mile distance was a breeze to walk. Just as Zelda had predicted, the Warden race had lost the courage to take the initiative in attacking. The lack was so present that they didn't even send warriors out to investigate the battle. There was simply no need. The Equality Altar Zelda had mentioned was the disc located in the center of the square. All around the Equality Altar, more than half of the arranged life lamps had gone out. When the Warden race's members noticed the extinguished life lamps, they looked grieved. Bergen, Bonnie, the leader of the Warden race, murmured in a low voice, as he stood in front of the extinguished life lamps. He closed his eyes sadly. The extinguishing of any respective life lamp represented the death of a member. If so many life lamps were currently extinguished, it meant that most of the people they'd sent out were now dead. These warriors were the Warden race's elites. Their death could only mean that the Warden race had suffered a crushing defeat. "Master, we are still alive," a voice shouted from behind. A man in a black robe pulled back his cloak and revealed his gray hair. He was very old. "Yes, we are, and we can still fight against them. Under the strength equalizing Thurgy's effect, our strength won't be any weaker than Bergen's. We have nothing to lose." Another old man also took off his black robe and stepped forward, showing himself. All the race members present were either the old, weak, sick or disabled people from the conservative faction. With the strength equalizing Thurgy, everyone would be equal, no matter how weak they were. They would thus have the same ability as the strong, and the only thing that would come into play would be their experience and martial arts skills. "You're right, I hadn't considered this option." The leader of the Warden race nodded, struggled to open his eyes fully, clenched his jaw and said, "We can still join the fight." With those words, he walked forward from the shadows of the Equality Altar. Not far off in the distance, the Tomb Keeper sat against a wall in a lazy manner. "Have you failed?" the Tomb Keeper asked casually. The leader of the Warden race nodded and replied, "Yes." The Tomb Keeper tilted his head and thought for a brief moment. The so-called strength equalizing Thurgy couldn't actually equalize all warriors' strength, as you have the grace from Herbert. But they still defeated you. The exiles aren't as simple as you think. "I know, and they'll be here soon. Sir, do you think you can help me with that?" the leader of the Warden race asked, while cupping his hands pleadingly. Prior to now, he could place his hope on Bergen and the others. Currently though, the Tomb Keeper seemed to be his best option. The Tomb Keeper nodded lightly. "I have agreed, and thus, I will certainly make my move. But don't expect me to risk my life for you." Chapter 2247, Right or Wrong. As for the Tomb Keeper, the battle of the Warden race had nothing to do with him. He was just a bystander at most. And considering his position and real strength, the Warden race had no right to ask him to fight on their behalf. He had been imprisoned here for a long time and had failed to explore the secret of the tombstone and win the bet. His days here had been a downright bore. As such, he accepted the invitation of the old head of the Warden race just because he wanted something to do. Even if all the people of the Warden race died miserable deaths in front of him, he would not be sad in the slightest. "Got it," the head of the Warden race nodded. Although he knew how powerful the Tomb Keeper was, he was also clear that he could not pin all his hopes on an outsider who had nothing to lose. At this moment, he was exhausted, both physically and mentally. He thought that it was perhaps time for him to put the battle between his race and the invaders to an end. 6 hours later, Zen and his companions were slowly walking along a dark road. The air around them was filled with a strange color. Led by Zelda, they turned a corner and saw a disc with a blue light flashing in the distance. "That is the Equality Altar," said Zelda as she looked at it. Beside the Equality Altar was a light blue stone tablet. This stone tablet was none other than the Prey tablet that she had mentioned earlier. The grace that the Warden race enjoyed befell from it. If Zelda and Luther managed to get closer to the Prey tablet, they would also be able to enjoy the grace of Herbert. "Will the effect of the strength equalizing Thurgy disappear if we destroy the Equality Altar?" Zen asked. Hearing his question, all the other exiles immediately pricked up their ears, waiting for an answer. This was what they were most concerned about. If it weren't for the strength-equalizing Thurgy, any one of them, even the weakest one, could defeat the warden race at will. Having their strength equalized had made all of them feel deep discomfort as they itched to fight with their true power. After all of the exiles were powerful warriors at the other shore realm, but many of them had been killed by the warden race. How could they tolerate such an insult? Yes, Zelda confirmed with a nod. Anyway, although the equality altar was close at hand, the rest of the warden race would be guarding it desperately, so it would definitely not be easy to destroy. After they walked another half a mile, they came face to face with people in black robes who continuously spilled out the sides of the square, forming a barrier and effectively blocking their way. An old man stepped out from the barrier, holding a crooked black crutch in his hand. At the end of his crutch was a blue light that continuously flashed. "Sir." Zelda came to a halt. Zen and the others also stopped behind her. Zelda, the leader of the warden race, looked at her with a complicated expression in his eyes. The warden race didn't have many members, so they were all familiar with one another. Like a small tribe, they had carefully managed this world by relying on one another. Before the conservative faction and the free faction broke up, Zelda had been very popular among the elders. Back then, even the leader of the warden race had taken good care of her. However, when the disputes between the two factions had become more and more complicated, the situation had gone out of control and the factions had gradually gone to the point of being dead enemies. "I'm sorry," Zelda said, lowering her head. She had no choice but to take revenge, but at the same time, she also felt guilty. This ambivalence had been torturing her ever since she entered this world. Luther, on the other hand, was much luckier. After all, he wasn't nearly as acquainted with the warden race. Since they had made him and his sister wander from place to place, he had just taken them as his enemies. "You don't have to apologize," the leader of the warden race said calmly. "I've thought about it a lot. Maybe you were right back then, maybe our persistence was just a joke." Only after the conversation with the tomb keeper had him realize that the prison they were in was not unique. Moreover, it did seem that their master had given up this place. Initially, it had been hard for him to accept what the mad guy had said, but on second thought, he had realized that it made sense. If their master really cared about this place, why hadn't he just killed all these intruders with his power? And if he really had abandoned this place, what was the point of the warden race's persistence? So, the decision of the free faction had been right all along. "Sir." Zelda was surprised. She had never expected that the old man would say such things. "But since we have come this far, we don't want to give up," the leader of the warden race continued resolutely. "Maybe we, the insignificant wardens, are destined to be like this. Even though our master has already abandoned us, we still have to sacrifice our most humble lives for his sake." The old man looked at Zelda, and then at Luther, who was standing behind her. With a complicated smile, he said, "If you win, you must live on. You will be the last remaining bloodline of our warden race." The leader of the warden race knew that their race was not a great race, it was far inferior to the snake goddess race and the Nine-Li race. However, he still hoped to see their bloodline continue. In the future, this would perhaps be the last trace of their race's existence in this world. "All the members of the warden race, listen to me. You are not allowed to attack Zelda and Luther," the leader of the warden race then ordered the clansmen behind him. "Why?" The cloaked man with purple hair stepped forward. He didn't understand why the leader was issuing such an order. How could they hope to win a fight if they couldn't attack two of their opponents? "Do as I say," the leader of the warden race said calmly. The man hesitated for a while, but in the end, he chose to be silent. In the warden race, the old man's word was final. Then, the old man raised his crutch with his wrinkled hands. As the blue light on his crutch continued to flash, all the people in black robes behind him also raised their weapons. Tears fell from Zelda's eyes as she began sobbing. She could no longer tell what was right and what was wrong. She only felt sorry for the fate of her own race. When Zen saw this scene, his expression became rather complicated. The truth was, he didn't want to attack these people. But just as the old man had said, they had already come this far, how could they choose to retreat at this stage? The old man hit the ground heavily with his crutch, and at once, the people in black robes charged forward. Zen was supposed to give an order in response, but he kept silent, still hesitating. Emily glanced at Zen and slightly shook her head. It seemed that Zen was still too young. Therefore, she gently waved her hand and ordered, "Fight!" Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The exiles also charged forward at once. On the other side of the equality altar, the tomb keeper slowly walked over and shook his head at the scene in front of him. Then, he took out two inconspicuous black knives from behind him. When he held them in his hands, there was a dramatic change in his temperament. The cynical look on his face disappeared, replaced by fierceness as he slowly swaggered forward. Chapter 2248, Pierced in the Chest. A series of bangs, cracks, whooshes sounded. The clanging sounds of the swords colliding with each other, the crackling sound of bones being broken, and the squelching of blood as a body was pieced by a sharp weapon, all these sounds rang out from time to time. Lives were like weeds, being ruthlessly uprooted and cast aside. The tomb keeper walked over briskly. He had a sharp gaze and looked relaxed. For him, this battle was a spicy deviation from his long years of boring cultivation. He had promised to help the warden race, but he had to choose his opponents carefully. Just ahead of him, Emily took a step forward. The annular saber in her hand circled around and shot towards a man in a black robe. Emily had made an ingenious move. Not only did it allow her to avoid the sword shadow that the man in the black robe had thrown at her, she had also feigned an attack, goading the other party into making a wrong judgment. The man in the black robe didn't know how to dodge and panicked. The annular saber whizzed past his neck. Before his blood could leave a mark on the saber, the man in the black robe had already fallen backwards. Bergen had cut in half the annular saber that she had previously used in order to save Zen. Emily had had to get a new one. Annular saber, the snake goddess race. The eyes of the tomb keeper widened as he saw the saber in Emily's hand. This type of weapon was unique and very few people were actually good at using it. As the tomb keeper recollected, only a few women in the snake goddess race were ever any good at using this kind of weapon. The most famous of all annular sabers in the snake goddess race as well as in the source world was called the soul-conquering ring. But Emily's trick had attracted his attention. Without a second thought, the tomb keeper chose Emily as his opponent. He stepped onto the ground and went straight up to Emily. Once Emily had killed the man in the black robe, she looked up, her beautiful eyes narrowed, and locked onto her second goal. A voice sounded just as she turned around. "You can be my opponent," the tomb keeper said with a smile. Emily looked askance at him. All the warden members were dressed in black. Even under their black robes, their clothes were of a color that remained distinct. The tomb keeper's clothes were completely different. Before Emily could respond, the tomb keeper rushed towards her, two daggers held aloft in his hands. Emily didn't hesitate. She turned the saber in her hand and brought it crashing down to the tomb keeper's face. She had used the perfect speed and strength in launching the strike. Ordinary people would have been forced to retreat in the face of such a strike, while Emily would close in and throw in deadly blows one after another. Once she forced her opponent to reveal a flaw in their defense, another deadly strike would find its way to them. But she hadn't expected the tomb keeper's strength. The tomb keeper had no intention of backing down and met Emily's attack head-on. He turned the two daggers into an angle that managed to block Emily's attack. The saber slid down along the length of the daggers, spraying sparks as it went. The moment the daggers twisted, Emily felt a strange force coming over her. She could hardly hold the saber in her hand and before long, it flew out of her hand. Emily retreated in a moment of desperation. Fear spread within her as she sized her opponent up once again. Everyone now had the same level of strength once the strength equalizing theurgy was activated. The Chaos Ancient God had proffered special treatment to the warden race. This meant that everyone else had to fend for themselves and find a way to utilize their strengths to win their fights. This man had only used two unremarkable daggers and he had still been able to perfectly utilize his strength. Emily knew dealing with him was going to be tricky. "You are not a member of the warden race?" Emily asked, frowning. "Who says I am?" the tomb keeper said, smiling. "Why did you help them?" Emily persisted. The tomb keeper shrugged and answered her, "Maybe because we've been neighbors for so long that I felt obliged to do it." That was all the explanation he offered. He then charged at Emily again, brandishing the two daggers. The tomb keeper wasn't very flexible. His movements looked rigid and clumsy, but he knew how to control his strength perfectly. Every time his daggers touched Emily's saber, the force affected Emily, making it difficult for Emily to hold on to the saber. So she kept retreating, constantly adjusting, and constantly trying her best to adapt to his attacks. The tomb keeper still had that jerky smile on his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. It wasn't until he had attacked her dozens of times in a row that Emily finally, completely adapted to his strength. But just as Emily attempted to counterattack, the tomb keeper suddenly changed his move. With a flip of both daggers, he sent one of them into the edge of the saber, and the other hit it hard with its sharp blade. The force pierced the saber and hit Emily's hand. Emily felt her hand numb, the saber finally flying out of her hand. The tomb keeper did not stop. He stabbed at Emily with the dagger in his left hand. Having lost her weapon, Emily had no choice but to grab the dagger. It cut open her palm, blood gushing out in rivulets. Ha ha, the tomb keeper laughed, and pushed the other dagger into Emily's chest. The dagger, which was several inches long, passed clear through Emily's body. Only the hilt and the top of the dagger could be seen on either side. Just at this moment, a blade came at him from the side. It carved a crooked path in the air, and was headed at the tomb keeper's right arm. This swordsmanship, the tomb keeper frowned. He couldn't even see the direction this sword momentum was coming from. And this unremarkable sword strike had now forced him to retreat. The dagger remained in Emily's body. Emily covered her chest with one hand, her face pale with the pain. Zen stood in front of Emily, a long sword in hand, and said, "Don't pull out the dagger. Hold on a minute." Such an injury as hers would have been undoubtedly fatal to an ordinary person. But for a powerful warrior at the other shore realm, the wound was minor, provided the strength-equalizing theurgy ended. The question was, could Emily hold on until then? The tomb keeper took a few steps backwards and looked at Zen with interest. "Here's someone else who looks more interesting." Zen raised his sword and rushed at the tomb keeper before he could finish talking. With a whooshing sound, the dozens of strikes that Zen had launched made their way over to the tomb keeper. When Zen's sword collided with the man's dagger, he could also feel a twisted force emanating from it. It was as if this force was pulling the long sword away from him. He felt like he could hardly hold the sword in his hands. The tomb keeper retreated before he was able to stabilize himself. Zen's swordsmanship was ingenious, but it was quite easy for the tomb keeper to see through it. Dozens of strikes later, his eyes flashed. He had found a way to break Zen's swordsmanship. He waved the dagger rapidly so that it spun like a flower. As the flower hit Zen's sword, Zen finally felt his right hand weaken, and his long sword forced out of his hand. The tomb keeper only smiled, and seemed to take it as a matter of course. He waved his dagger at Zen, but in this moment, he sensed that something was wrong. He suddenly looked up to find that in a whirlpool in the air, a speck of green starlight was rapidly descending onto his head. Chapter 2249, Interrogation. The tomb keeper was startled by the sudden falling starlight. He hadn't thought that the fellow in front of him would be able to activate the theurgy at this time. Without time to think about anything, he abruptly gritted his teeth and rolled away. Bang! The starlight almost grazed his scalp as it fell and left a big crater in the ground. The tomb keeper looked up at Zen with a strange expression on his face. "The truth theurgy, where did you cultivate it?" As one of the most powerful masters in the source world, he knew that the truth theurgy was very rare. A cultivator could use the grand world cultivation method to comprehend the godly way. When they reached the top level of the godly way, they could master the truth of godly way, and then get to the other shore. Only those with great talent and perseverance would finally be able to succeed. As for how long they could move forward after arriving at the other shore, that would depend on their own abilities. However, it was impossible for anyone to comprehend the truth on their own. This was a widely accepted fact in the source world. So now, seeing Zen use the truth theurgy was a great surprise to the tomb keeper. However, Zen just ignored him. He was surprised to know that the tomb keeper was able to see through his bloodline theurgy, but he didn't want to waste his time on such trifles. He knew that the best course of action would be to finish the battle as soon as possible. Whoosh! As the truth crystal rotated, another green star fell down. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Zen turned around and picked up his long sword from the ground. A beam of green light enveloped the sword as he rushed toward the tomb keeper. At the same time, Emily was kneeling on the ground and breathing deeply with her hand pressed to her chest. As blood flowed along the edge of the blade, she felt her consciousness blurring away. A sense of crisis flooded her. Was she going to die here today? In the current state that she was in, she would not be able to hold on for a long time. That guy is so determined. She stared blankly at Zen in the distance, feeling a little touched in her heart. No one had moved her this much in a long time. As the fierce battle raged on, more and more warriors fell to the ground, never to get back up again. The sound of their miserable cries and the smell of blood filled the air. To a certain extent, wars among warriors who had mortal bodies were more cruel and bloody than those among the mighty masters. On the other side, the purple-haired man from the warden race leapt off the roof in pursuit of an exile. The exile was seriously injured and spilling a trail of blood behind him as he ran. After a moment, he stumbled and let out a heavy gasp, almost unable to catch his breath. Whoosh! The purple-haired man stopped and, with the blue saber in his hand, slashed at the exile. Die. He hated these invaders with a passion. If it weren't for them, he would have likely become the new leader of the warden race after the current one died. The exile had exhausted his strength, so he could only roll on the ground to avoid the attack. However, it was too late for him to get up. Crack! The purple-haired man raised the saber once more and swung down. This time, he hit his target. The exile's head flew off his body. Then, the man turned around to return to the battlefield. He had come a long way from the battlefield in order to hunt down this exile. But just as he jumped up and climbed onto the roof, a black rope suddenly appeared in front of his neck. Before he could react, the rope was pulled back at a very fast speed. His instincts told him to cut off the rope with the saber in his hand. However, he had barely lifted his right arm when he felt it go cold. In a split second, it was neatly cut off from below his elbow. As soon as he spoke, he felt his left arm and his legs go cold as well. All his limbs had been cut off. The chill lasted for a few seconds before he felt an unbearable pain shoot through his body. The severe pain made his face turn completely scarlet, and the muscles on his face constantly twisted around. At this moment, a man walked out of the dark corner. When the purple-haired man turned to his direction, a look of surprise came over his face. Spark. The warden race had planned to use Spark's power to fight against Emily, but the result had not been satisfying, so they had chosen to give up. However, the purple-haired man hadn't expected that Spark would escape the disaster and appear here at this time. With a sharp knife in his hand, Spark looked down at the man with purple hair and said with a sneer, "I'm the one who has always schemed against others. I didn't expect you to play a trick on me this time. Ha ha, you are also prisoners in this world. How can our warden race let you go?" The purple-haired man said snidely, bearing the sharp pain. "You are right, we've been in different positions from the beginning, so we should not cooperate." Spark nodded and pointed the knife in his hand at the purple-haired man. "Tell me how to remove the strength equalizing theurgy." The purple-haired man sneered, "Do you think I'll tell you?" Spark shrugged. Without any hesitation, he stabbed the sharp knife into the belly of the purple-haired man. Then, he slowly slid the knife to the left, making a small cut. "If you can't help me remove the strength equalizing theurgy in 5 minutes, you will bleed to death. Whether you die or stay alive is up to you." Then, Spark stepped back and leaned against the wall with an indifferent expression on his face. With all his limbs gone, the man with purple hair was unable to move or stop his bleeding. If he continued like this, he would definitely die. The only way to save himself was to terminate the strength equalizing theurgy. But right now, the warden race still had the strength to fight against the invaders. However, if he did as Spark said and stopped the strength equalizing theurgy, Emily alone would be able to defeat their whole race. Drip, drip, drip. As the sound of blood dripping reached the man's ear, a hint of panic appeared on his face. Sensing his anxiety, Spark smiled. "The only person who can save you is yourself." The man with purple hair had a fierce struggle in his heart. He was not afraid of death, but he was unwilling to die silently like this. After about 30 seconds, he said, "There are 2 solutions. The first one is to reset the equality altar to the original state, and the other is to destroy the equality altar." "Which way is faster?" Spark asked. "The first one. It's not that easy to destroy the equality altar. With your current ability, you wouldn't be able to destroy it even after several days and nights." "Tell me the way to reset it then," Spark said calmly. Soon, Spark left the corner and wiped away the blood on his sharp knife. There was a fierce battle going on not far away. He sneered in that direction and then walked in another direction. Now that all of the warriors of the warden race had been sent out to fight, there was no one guarding the equality altar. It was not easy to destroy the equality altar, and only a few members of the warden race knew how to reset it, so it was meaningless to guard the equality altar now. At this time, Spark quietly appeared on the other side of the square and quickly strode to the equality altar. Chapter 2250, Deactivate the Strength Equalizing Theurgy. Swish. Zen slashed the sword in front of him with practiced ease, leaving a barely noticeable mark on the wall. The house groaned, and a second later, collapsed with a deafening sound. Unfortunately, as fierce as Zen's sword was, it was unable to hurt the tombkeeper. Zen weighed the sword in his hand, face solemn. Everyone became ordinary under the effect of the strength equalizing theurgy, and in theory, Zen would be mostly unrivaled under this condition. However, he didn't expect the tombkeeper's body to be this tough. Even if he utilized the truth crystal, he still couldn't do anything to the tombkeeper and it was frustrating him to no end. "Let's make a deal," said the tombkeeper as he dexterously spun the dagger in his hand. If I defeat you, you'll tell me how you cultivated the truth theurgy. What do you think? The sudden proposal puzzled Zen. He thought the tombkeeper would be on the warden race's side, but judging from his attitude, it looked like he didn't really care much whether the race lived or died. I have no time for such nonsense. Zen extended his arm, and with a slight turn of the truth crystal in his palm, starlight shone down the tombkeeper. Not a second after, Zen darted towards the tombkeeper, his sword enveloped in a green light. Swish! The tombkeeper took half a step back, as cool and indifferent as ever. This was how he moved, calculated and precise. He didn't blink once as the starlight hit his body. And as Zen's sword came at him, he merely tilted his head, narrowly missing a gash on the neck. His movements looked like dancing. Any carelessness would lead him to death. He moved leisurely, as if he was waltzing and not fighting to the death. It irked Zen, but he guessed it would be good for him if the tombkeeper made a wrong step. If it weren't for the strength equalizing theurgy, Zen could easily claim victory by using the 8 smoky melodies. The tombkeeper, however, only had his experience to rely on. He must have perfect perception of energy, thought Zen. Watching his opponent's fluid body movement secretly frightened Zen, prompting him to make fiercer and stronger attacks. Boom, 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 3 beams of starlight fell on the tombkeeper's head. His body twisted slightly, barely dodging the light beams. He lifted his dagger and hacked at Zen. Whoosh! Zen had thrust his long sword just in time, stabbing at the tombkeeper multiple times. He aimed his strikes where the vital organs would be, but the tombkeeper remained unharmed. Even though Zen's sword strikes were random, the tombkeeper could still make accurate judgments. You don't want to tell me, huh? Looks like I have no choice but to force it out of you. The tombkeeper said as he constantly dodged Zen's attacks. Swish! Zen swung his sword at the tombkeeper. But the body of the tombkeeper was like a willow, avoiding Zen's attacks with ease. The tombkeeper then came forward and hit Zen's wrist with his dagger's hilt. Clang! Zen's sword fell on the ground. Having lost his weapon, Zen gritted his teeth and once again summoned a beam of starlight, smashing it down the tombkeeper. The tombkeeper's eyes gleamed as he quickly moved behind Zen. He grabbed Zen's neck and pushed him forward, right below the falling starlight. Say it, he said. Seeing that the starlight was about to hit Zen's head, the tombkeeper suddenly pulled him back. Cold sweat rolled down Zen's forehead. Just now, his life had been entirely under the control of the tombkeeper. If the tombkeeper hadn't pulled him back, he most likely would have been killed by his own starlight. However, Zen did not intend to give up. As soon as he was upright, he turned around and pushed his elbow towards the tombkeeper's face. The tombkeeper's mouth curled in growing annoyance. He maneuvered his body to dodge Zen's elbow as his hands snaked up Zen's shoulders. Crack, crack, Zen's arms were dislocated and drooped feebly with 2 crisp sounds. Still want to do this? The tombkeeper asked again. Phew, Zen raised his leg and kicked towards the tombkeeper. Crack, crack, the tombkeeper avoided the kick and with a light tap, dislocated Zen's legs as well. Zen's knees buckled and he fell face first on the ground. Zen lay down, gasping for breath. He was helpless. Never had he been defeated by someone with the same strength as him. It had almost been impossible for Emily to defeat him under the effect of the strength equalizing theurgy. But the tombkeeper dominated him easily. Actually, I can guess even if you don't say it, said the tombkeeper, as he looked down at Zen. You learned the truth theurgy from Othniel. I went to see him when he just came to this world, but he didn't talk to me. Othniel. Zen's eyes widened. Number 9527 had never called its master by his name. It looked like its master was called Othniel. Countless top figures in the source world scrambled for the truth theurgy, and they went to great lengths to obtain it. Some of them even had the delusion to create the godly way's great unity, but in the end, they still got nothing. But why did he choose you? Curiosity and annoyance laced the tombkeeper's voice. The tombkeeper had visited Othniel in the hope that he could learn the truth theurgy, only to be disappointed. In fact, the reason why the tombkeeper stayed here was that he wanted to obtain the truth godly way. It was why he made that bet with Herbert. In the eyes of the tombkeeper, as a top-ranked true god, Zen was indeed outstanding enough. However, he had seen many true gods as outstanding as Zen. There were, after all, too many powerful true gods in the source world. And if he was being honest, Zen wasn't anywhere near the top 10. But why was it that Zen got the truth theurgy without much effort when he had spent countless hours and energy trying to learn it, only to fail every time? Tell me why he chose you, the tombkeeper continued, his eyes never straying from Zen. Zen only turned his head aside. I have a way to make you speak, the tombkeeper said. But just as the tomb keeper pressed on Zen harder, a loud whirring sound suddenly came from far away. When the tomb keeper heard this, he looked up at the equality altar and frowned. Why did the warden race deactivate the strength equalizing theurgy now? Were they playing with death? It was already difficult to fight against the intruders under the effect of the strength equalizing theurgy. Just imagine how it would be with the strength equalizing theurgy gone. As the equality altar rotated slowly, it emitted dots of orange light which began to spread in all directions. Activating the strength equalizing theurgy was a process that moved from inside to outside and from slow to fast. Deactivating it was the same. Spark, who was standing in the center of the equality altar, was the first to be infiltrated by the orange light. When his cultivation base was restored, a sinister smile appeared on his face. At this moment, the group of people not far from the altar were just a group of ants for him. Realizing it was his chance, he shouted, "All of you! Go to perdition!" His voice echoed in the sky. Chapter 2251, Irritated. It would take the equality altar some time to remove the strength equalizing theurgy completely. It took about 9 seconds for the orange dots to disperse from the equality altar and spread to Emily and the others. But those 9 seconds were enough for Spark. Now that the constraint on his body had been cast off and he finally regained his strength, the power began to disperse. If another Shore Realm warrior went out to fight, it wouldn't be a challenge to kill countless mortals. Spark let out a roar of fury as his body started to swell up, eventually turning into a giant that was 4 million feet tall. Crack! 8 flashes of dragon-shaped lightning furiously circled him. Spark felt immense joy as he thought of those men dying in his hands. Emily, Timotheus, all the exiles, and the warden race members, you all should go to perdition. Without any hesitation, Spark reached out his hand and tapped the air. The 8 flashes of dragon-shaped lightning circled each other, and then poured towards the warriors who were busy fighting. At that moment, everyone was confused. The leader of the warden race with a walking stick and a bent body let out a faint sigh. A huge wave of helplessness struck him. He didn't want to think about how Spark would manage to break the strength equalizing theurgy. The warden race was on the verge of falling down. Even if the tomb keeper had defeated 2 of the most powerful intruders, it didn't help ease the situation. The leader also couldn't ask the tomb keeper to do more for them. They were running out of options. Doing anything at all was useless. The massive power had intimidated even Emily, Timotheus, and the other exiles. When they saw Spark, their eyes were filled with nothing but resentment. Letting Spark escape before was a terrible idea. No one had thought he would do such a thing. The 8 flashes of dragon-shaped lightning had approached in just a blink of an eye. With the explosive sound of lightning, everyone's eardrums were shattered, and their ears began to bleed. After all, they were just mere mortals. That kind of power was more than enough to wipe them all out. A bitter smile crept up on Zen's face as he witnessed the scene from the ground. He never thought everyone would just die after fighting for so long. The tomb keeper stood beside Zen, looking at the gruesome view with his mouth slightly open. He also never expected such a thing to happen. Dang it, I was careless. If only there was no strength equalizing theurgy, Spark would have been easier to take down. He didn't even take all the exiles seriously, not to mention Spark. At that time, orange light spots still fluttered slowly from a distance. Without his cultivation base, the dragon-shaped lightning could directly devour him. The tomb keeper wasn't any ordinary other Shore Realm warrior. He was one of the few most powerful warriors in the source world. The strength equalizing theurgy belonged to the truth theurgy. Although it had suppressed him a lot, he still had a way to hold out against it. At that crucial moment of life and death, the tomb keeper grew serious. "Come on," he shouted. Blood textures then spread on his face like bright clouds. At the same time, blue veins began to emerge on the surfaces of his body. He struggled for a little bit, and then, buzz, streaks of blue light leaked out of his body. When Zen, who was still on the ground, noticed the changes happening with the tomb keeper, his eyes widened. It was those blue lights that affected everyone's cultivation base. The blue dots might represent the strength equalizing theurgy. That fellow was actually able to resist that theurgy and had managed to force the blue dots out of his body. The strength equalizing theurgy was arranged by the Chaos Ancient God. Only then did Zen realize how powerful the tomb keeper really was. It didn't surprise him why he lost to the tomb keeper. After all the blue light dots were forced out, the tomb keeper's aura also drastically changed. At that moment, the 8 flashes of dragon-shaped lightning glided over. The waves caused by the lightning gushed over, and the houses on both sides of the road began to collapse. The exiles and the members of the Warden race were directly annihilated by the dragon-shaped lightning. The attack left no room for resistance or avoidance. The lightning continued to extend all the way to the front of the Tomb Keeper. He slightly stretched out his hand and pointed a finger to the ground. Zen didn't feel any kind of special energy being used by the Tomb Keeper. However, the 8 flashes of dragon-shaped lightning failed to move further. An invisible shield stood in front of the Tomb Keeper. Those bolts of lightning followed the direction where the Tomb Keeper's finger was pointed. All of them went straight to the ground. Is he able to control others' powers? Zen thought, obviously dumbfounded by what he had just witnessed. Boom, 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 the 8 bolts of lightning continued to descend, causing a huge, deep crater in the ground. Zen flopped himself on the edge of the huge crater as if he was lying on the side of a cliff. Spark was filled with confidence when he launched this attack. He believed that no one was going to resist such power even if he used only a little bit of it. However, something groundbreaking had occurred. Someone not only blocked his attack but also took his strength away. How was that possible? Even though Emily regained her strength, she couldn't do something like that. Spark narrowed his eyes and glared at the Tomb Keeper. "Who are you?" Spark asked. His voice was loud, but only the Tomb Keeper could hear it as everyone else's eardrums had been shattered. "What makes you think you have the right to know that?" The Tomb Keeper said casually, raising his arm to point mockingly at Spark. At that very moment, he was more displeased than before. He helped the Warden race with the battle and even fought Zen. He was very relaxed amidst all those events. To him, those were just a touch of spice for his boring life. However, Spark suddenly broke the strength equalizing Thurgy, forcing the Tomb Keeper to break free from restraint of this Thurgy by himself. Even for the Tomb Keeper, putting up a fight against the Chaos Ancient God wasn't going to be a walk in the park. He would have to pay a huge price if he did such a thing. That annoyed the Tomb Keeper to a great extent. He had wasted so much over a nobody like Spark. All he wanted was to tear Spark into pieces. When the Tomb Keeper smacked the air, an invisible hand struck Spark pretty hard. All of a sudden, Spark felt an uncontrollable force crushing his body that stood 4 million feet high. The sound of his bones cracking was as loud as thunderclaps. Crack, crack, crack. Spark's huge head was crushed flat even before he could get rid of the wild god body. His huge body collapsed, resembling a mountain that was caving in. After his spiritual soul was obliterated, the wild god power began to quickly evaporate. His huge body continued to shrink into pieces until all of it disappeared right before everyone's very eyes. It wasn't until then that the orange dots slowly drifted into everyone's body. Chapter 2252, The Human Sovereign. Emily was already exhausted and reached her limit. She started losing her strength because of the excessive loss of blood, and her face paled just like a piece of paper. She felt like she was at the gate of death, and her spirit would leave her any time now. She had no recollection at all about what had happened. She only knew that this time, she had to rely on her remaining willpower to hold on. In the midst of her struggle, the orange light suddenly shot into her body. Her originally suppressed cultivation was quickly restored. In the blink of an eye, the almost exhausted power of life was powered up and became full. Her weakened body had been instantly energized exponentially as her haggard breath had recovered. She didn't need to use any Thurgy. She could recover in a short period of time by just depending on her powerful physical body and blood. The dagger, which was stabbed on her chest, drew itself out of the wound under the wriggling of her muscles. The wound was then completely healed without a scar, leaving only a flawless skin. At the same time Emily began to recover, the other severely injured exiles had also been healed. Powerful auras spread out and pervaded the space. The black-robed men of the Warden race were not excluded and had also restored their own cultivation. Of all the members of their race, no one had ever reached the other shore realm. As a result, compared to Emily and the other exiles, their auras were comparably small. The surroundings were still. Emily and the rest did not make a move. Everyone turned their gazes to Zen. An extremely powerful monster was standing beside him. The Tomb Keeper could get rid of the power of the strength equalizing Thurgy by himself. With just a single slap, he could easily kill Spark of the Yellow Emperor race. Both Emily and Timotheus were in awe looking at such a powerful man. If by chance, the Tomb Keeper would fight along the Warden race's side, they would surely have no chance of survival at all. But at the thought, Emily didn't feel anxious. The Tomb Keeper was obviously not, in a chance, under the control of the Warden race. His power alone could defeat all the exiles. It just showed that the Warden race didn't have a hold on him. If the Warden race could really order him around, then they wouldn't need to activate the strength equalizing Thurgy. Zen, who was no longer suppressed by the strength-equalizing theurgy, slowly stood up from the ground. When the Tombkeeper displayed such powerful strength, the battle between them and the Tombkeeper seemed to be of no importance. After everyone's normal condition had been restored, they waited for the instructions of the Tombkeeper. Click, click, the head of the warden race threw away his walking stick and quickly walked up to the Tombkeeper, making a bow with his hands clasped. The scene of the Tombkeeper's act just now greatly shocked the warden race. Our race has been your neighbor for so many years. Please drive these exiles away for the sake of our master. The head of the warden race knew in his heart that the Tombkeeper would be a bigger help as the last life-saving straw for their race. Hearing his words, Emily and the rest of the exiles were stunned. Once the Tombkeeper was persuaded to join hands with the warden race, they would surely lose everything. Sir, I was the leader of the Rose sect in the Pear Hill, and I'm not willing to be imprisoned here. If I can return to the Pear Hill, I will remember the favor, Emily interjected and said. The Tombkeeper looked at Emily and spoke in a cold voice, you are from the Pear Hill. Ha ha ha. His weird laughter made Emily's blood freeze. The crowd that just heard his words and laughter stood still and felt nervous. In the Source world, there were countless powerful masters. Since the ancient times, a lot of people had been born with indescribable talents. Due to this, powerful forces had been established. Among the powerful forces that had been established was the Snake Goddess race, which was one of the strongest races in the Source world. If the Tombkeeper had a grudge against the Snake Goddess race, Emily's words might have an adverse effect. She certainly knew how to weigh the pros and cons. But the Tombkeeper had helped the Warden race after the strength-equalizing theurgy was activated. And if he agreed to help the Warden race this time, they might have no chance to survive being on the losing end. The Tombkeeper had stared at Emily for a while, and his face slowly darkened. It was as if some unforgettable memories had been stirred up and haunted him. He uttered, not to mention that you're just an insignificant sect leader of the Pear Hill, even if the Snake Goddess feels grateful to me, I, as her brother, will not accept. Brother? Did the Snake Goddess have a brother? Zen's expression turned strange as he heard the Tombkeeper's words. Not just Zen, but Emily, Timotheus and other exiles were once again given a start by the sudden revelation. It had never occurred to them that they would meet the Snake Goddess's brother in this place. Emily stared in disbelief at the Tombkeeper and stammered, You are the human sovereign, Fuxi. Tien, Fuxi is a culture hero in Chinese legend and mythology. The existence of the human sovereign Fuxi in the Source world was extraordinary, and he held a high position. Every exile was aware and had heard of his name. The Tombkeeper snorted and acquiesced in Emily's guess. Master Fuxi, the Snake Goddess has been depressed since your disappearance. We have never seen her smile over the past countless years. I didn't expect that you were trapped, no stayed, here, Emily humbly said. This prison had served as a trap for the exiled, but it was not the same case for the Tombkeeper. For her, Fuxi couldn't be trapped in this place. A glimmer of light showed in Fuxi's eyes as he asked, Really? Of course. Before I was exiled, we held a party in the Pear Hill but the Snake Goddess didn't appear. It was said that it was also because of you, Emily responded. As the leader of the Rose sect, Emily enjoyed a high position in the Pear Hill, so she knew some secrets. The Snake Goddess and Fuxi were originally brother and sister, but later they became husband and wife. But for some unknown reason, Fuxi suddenly left in anger and eventually disappeared from the Source world. The Snake Goddess had tried her means to look for him, but failed several times. Unbeknownst to everyone, he had already left the Source world and hid at the bottom of the chaos, stayed and never went out for so many years. Fuxi heard Emily's words and had a complex expression on his face. He let out a long sigh. He, after all, still cared about his sister. He looked back at the head of the Warden race and said, As I told you, this world is a failure, and Herbert has abandoned it. I helped you as we agreed. You have lost. Let them go, and I will protect your race. The head of the Warden race already knew that Fuxi could not be on their side as he listened to his conversation with Emily. It was a great honor that he was still willing to protect their race. The head had no other choice but to accept. Fuxi, after speaking his statement, swiftly grabbed Zen and ordered, Follow me. Immediately after, he and Zen flew backwards. Seeing this scene, Timotheus panicked and shouted, Master Fuxi. But Fuxi just ignored him. In the blink of an eye, the two disappeared from everyone's sight. Emily saw how anxious Timotheus was and comforted him, Don't worry. Zen will be fine. Fuxi's intention on taking Zen away was still unclear, but she knew that he had no reason to harm him. She shrugged the thought aside and kept her focus on what was important at this moment. Now that they had already won the battle, it was time to cut off the curse chains on their bodies. Chapter 2253, Jealousy. Zen skimmed through a row of low houses and saw a mountain from a distance. He saw that a row of black tombstones stood, lined up along the said mountain. After they flew over these tombstones, one singular tombstone stood out as it was tall and placed at the back. Just as Zen was wondering who was buried under this tombstone, Fuxi threw him down randomly. To his surprise, Zen fell to the ground. 1 foot close to the ground, Zen merely tapped his toe and stood steadily beneath the tombstone. Just then, Fuxi flashed and appeared right beside Zen. Zen took a long, intent look at the tombstone. There were no inscribed words or carvings on it, so he didn't know who was buried here. "Why did you take me here?" Zen asked. With a calm expression on his face, Fuxi looked like an ordinary person without anything unusual. No one would have guessed that he had killed Spark, another Shore Realm warrior, so easily. Fuxi didn't answer Zen's question and instead, lightly tapped on the tombstone. Just as his hand stopped tapping, gold threads slowly spread out at the bottom of the tombstone. These gold threads climbed up and soon spread all over the tombstone. Looking at the threads, Zen couldn't seem to understand them. "I have stayed here for a very long time, about 30 billion years, said Fuxi, staring at the fine, majestic lines. "Even for me, 30 billion years is not a short time. I have wasted all my time here." "You are not trapped here, aren't you?" Zen asked, puzzled. "You could have left as you wished. Why didn't you leave?" All Zen knew was that the man in front of him, Fuxi, was very powerful. Besides, he was the brother of Snake Goddess. Because of this, he had the notion that no one could imprison him no matter how bad they wanted to. This guy chose to stay, and yet he was complaining that he had wasted his time here. Zen shook his head in bewilderment. "Leave." Fuxi's eyes flashed with a golden light, and his hand had already placed on Zen's shoulder. Crackle. Just then, an intense force began to drop on Zen's shoulder, which sent his bones shattering. Right before the pain began to take over his body, Fuxi's hand flashed bright light and Zen's broken shoulder was back to normal again. "Do you know what will happen if I leave?" Fuxi asked coldly. Zen pursed his lips and said, "No, I don't know." "Aren't you curious?" the man asked again. "Frankly, no, I am not," replied Zen with a shrug. Fuxi was rendered speechless at his response. The guts this guy had were unbelievable. On Zen's behalf, he wanted nothing but to cut off the curse chain and leave this prison. Whether Fuxi wanted to stay or not had nothing to do with him. Fuxi was angry. "It seems that you know nothing about it. It didn't make sense at all. Why would Othniel choose you? Why?" Hearing this, Zen rolled his eyes in annoyance. He didn't know that such a question bothered Fuxi for so long. But even though Fuxi seemed to care so much, Zen didn't care about the bloodline of the Chaos Ancient God. As everyone knew, the Truth Theurgy was too complicated to be understood, but its power was not so extraordinary. The only time when one could show its use was after the activation of the Strength Equalizing Theurgy. But now that Zen wanted to return to the Divine Land, it was impossible for the Warden race to use the Strength Equalizing Theurgy in the Divine Land. Considering his current state and everything that had happened, the Truth Theurgy was nothing to him. "For your information, I have no idea why he even chose me in the first place," Zen sassed. "Can I leave now?" "Of course not." As he spoke, Fuxi slammed his palm hard against the tombstone, and the gold threads that emerged from it began to tremble crazily. Fuxi had just patted Zen's shoulder casually, and the force that erupted from that slap made his bones turn into pieces. But this tombstone seemed to be made from some special material, and it still stood firmly after being slapped by Fuxi. "I made a bet with Herbert," Fuxi expressed as he gritted his teeth. "If I can't discover the secret on this tombstone, I will never leave this world. I want Herbert to approve of me and finally give me his blood. This is my only hope." Now it all made sense. The main reason why Fuxi had stayed here for the past 30 billion years was to acquire the Truth Theurgy of the Chaos Ancient God. In Fuxi's opinion, it was impossible to obtain the Truth Theurgy through mediation. The only way to obtain it was to have the Chaos Ancient God's bloodline. Though Herbert gave him hope, Fuxi remained unable to solve the mystery. As for Othniel, he did not pay attention to Fuxi at all. Fuxi was such a powerful character. He had pursued the Truth Theurgy hard but failed. Yet here was Zen, who gained it so easily. How could he not be angry? How could he be not jealous of Zen? The mystery of this tombstone should come down to the understanding of the godly way's great unity, Fuxi declared. Hence, I will take advantage of your truth crystal to solve the mystery by backstepping. You are not allowed to leave until I do so. Now you can show me the truth crystal. He was cold and harsh, unwavering to anything that stood before him and his goal. With his talent, only a handful of things could ever faze him. The reason why he was unable to discover the mystery hidden in the tombstone was because of the restriction of the godly way's great unity. Because of this, he assumed that using Zen's truth crystal could solve it, especially because the crystal had been obtained by the chaos ancient god from the godly way's great unity. Zen was slightly shocked to hear this. This guy had been meditating here for 30 billion years, but he had not yet figured out the mystery of the tombstone. If he can't master it, will I have to stay here for countless years, too? He thought to himself. What if you still can't comprehend it? Zen just had to ask. Then I guess you'll be stuck with me for a while, Fuxi sneered. No way. Zen's face flushed with anxiousness and concern. But even though he wanted to retaliate so bad, Zen had no choice but to obey to the powerful Fuxi. However, at the same moment, No 9527's consciousness suddenly came out from the sclerite in Zen's chest. Fuxi, don't waste your time. We will never ever choose you. After number 9527 had sneaked into Zen's body, it wasn't planning on directly communicating with anyone. However, it chose to talk to Fuxi this time. As soon as Fuxi sensed the words coming out of Zen's mind, his body suddenly trembled. He stared at Zen's chest and asked, You are Othniel. No, I am not, number 9527 beckoned back. I am a mere fragment of his soul. A part of his soul. Fuxi's eyes flickered in confusion. Give up now. I advise you not to make things difficult for Zen. After all, he was handpicked by our master. Keeping him here would anger the master, and he would surely make you suffer, number 9527 continued. Chapter 2254, Finale Hero. The area was filled with No 9527's calm but slightly threatening voice. Fuxi wasn't afraid of Othniel's soul fragment, but of Othniel himself. But, number 9527 represented Othniel in this situation. The thought of it made Fuxi cautious. Furthermore, he didn't expect that Othniel had left a strand of his soul in Zen's body, which only showed that he thought of Zen as highly important to him. I once visited Othniel, but why did he refuse me? Am I really not qualified? Fuxi said as he stared at Zen. He had long wanted to master a truth theurgy. He knew that he was strong and intelligent enough in every way. Yet, neither Herbert nor Othniel took him as a disciple. Herbert even posed a problem for him, which made him feel very bothered. Are you tired of this cycle of reincarnation? Compared to the numerous creatures in the chaos, you have always been the most dazzling one. You are already very lucky. Number 9527 countered. There was silence for a while before Fuxi shouted in anger, Of course I am tired of it. I am tired of the endless cycles of reincarnation. Everyone will die and be born again and again. What's the point of living in this way? This is exactly the point, as my master once said, replied number 9527. Shoot, I'm afraid your master has been also tired of such a way, or why did he choose this guy? Fuxi complained and pointed accusingly at Zen. When Zen saw Fuxi was annoyed, he subconsciously dodged. He didn't want Fuxi to kill him in a fit of rage. It was because of that very matter that Fuxi had a dispute with the snake goddess, and left. He was stubborn, and wouldn't change his mind once he'd decided. Maybe you're right, my master also gets tired. But I don't know the reason why he didn't choose you. Since he has chosen Zen now, you shouldn't make things difficult for him, number 9527 said. Fuxi couldn't help his eyelids twitch in irritation. He stared viciously at Zen, before he jumped about like a possessed man and declared, Only I can succeed. I am the chosen one. I will be the finale hero. Zen is not qualified. He had obviously gone a bit dotty, so number 9527 and Zen just kept quiet. After a long while, Fuxi finally calmed down. He glanced coldly at Zen and said, You can leave now. Well, are you okay? Zen asked. For some reason, he suddenly felt pity for Fuxi. Both of them had different goals. For Zen, what Fuxi pursued was worthless. Fuxi had done so much but he couldn't get what he wanted, which was really pathetic. One of Fuxi's hands rested on the tombstone. He waved at Zen with the other and said, You have no right to care about me. Since when did he need a true god to care about him? And so, Zen just shrugged and turned around, ready to leave. At that moment, he heard Fuxi say, Wait a minute. He turned around and looked at Fuxi in confusion. He didn't know what the other man wanted to do. You mainly practice the truth of cultivation nature, but you haven't become a consummate true god? Fuxi asked. Zen nodded. Until now, he he was still a top-rank true god, and hadn't become a consummate one yet. Perhaps, it had something to do with the infinity ruler in his mind. His godly tile was too complex and had already absorbed hundreds of kinds of godly ways in the divine land. Because of this, it was difficult for him to improve his cultivation level, and therefore he had not yet become a consummate true god. "You're strange," said Fuxi as he stared at Zen up and down. Generally speaking, it wasn't difficult for a talented true god to reach the consummation level in the source world, but it was extremely hard to comprehend the truths of godly ways. Zen seemed to be the opposite. Fuxi had felt several kinds of truths of godly ways from Zen, and he could tell that the truth of cultivation nature seemed to be complete. He was even qualified to cross the sea of truth. That was why he felt strange that Zen was different from other true gods. He even wondered if Othniel chose Zen because of this. "May I have a look at your godly tile?" he asked. "I'm afraid not," Zen said with a shake of his head. Although Fuxi didn't look hostile, Zen did not want to show him everything. When Fuxi noticed that Zen had become more vigilant, he just smiled. "I also cultivated the truth of cultivation nature in the past, and thus reached the other shore realm. I can help you break through the current shackles and give you some advice," he continued. At that point, Zen's eyes flashed at his words. It was true that Othniel had transplanted his blood into Zen, but this didn't help him in his cultivation. Of course, Fuxi was incredibly strong. If he gave Zen some advice. As soon as Fuxi saw that Zen became less stiff, he smiled and pointed at his belly. Zen had felt his belly heat up. Before he could stop Fuxi, the man had released a strand of his soul into his inner world. "Your godly tile." He was taken aback when he first saw Zen's godly tile, but it was quickly replaced with laughter. "What are you laughing at?" Zen asked with a frown. "Idiot, I thought you were special, but it turns out that you are not. Did Othniel think you could merge the godly ways successfully?" Fuxi chuckled. He immediately noticed that something was off with Zen's godly tile as soon as the strand of his soul entered Zen's inner world. It was known that the godly tile was the crystallization of a certain amount of energy. Most of the true gods usually cultivated only one energy. Only a very few talented ones could master 2 or 3 kinds of energy. Such was true in both the divine land and the source world. Still, there were many reckless people in the world. They knew that it was impossible to comprehend the truth theurgies because they came from the energy of the godly ways great unity at the dawn of chaos. That was the only chance to obtain the truth theurgies. Other than that, they could only rely on the blood transplantation of the chaos ancient gods. However, it was even harder to have the blood of chaos ancient gods. Fuxi had tried for so long, but he still couldn't get it. Therefore, they blended the energy of the godly ways in order to artificially create the godly ways great unity, and get the truth theurgies. They had expected a good outcome, but no one had actually succeeded. The godly tile that was formed from that way was not complete. As time passed by, the method was eventually abandoned. That was why the moment Fuxi saw that kind of godly tile on Zen, he thought that it was ridiculous. "It's not the reason why my master chose Zen. Of course, he knows that the merging of godly ways won't work," number 9527 retorted. Fuxi nodded at its words. His lips curved into a smile. He became much more comfortable and said to Zen, "Although you have mastered many godly ways, I can still help you become a consummate true god. Choose a godly way yourself." Chapter 2255, The 8 Diagrams Chart. A look of puzzlement appeared on Zen's face. "Do you also have 3,000 godly ways?" he asked. Fuxi had laughed at Zen for his stupid behavior of integrating the godly ways just now. And then, he told Zen that he could choose any godly way as he liked. Did that mean that Fuxi also cultivated the 3,000 godly ways? Chiyu was supposedly the creator of the 3,000 godly ways, so how could he know them? There was a touch of embarrassment on Fuxi's face. "I don't know all the 3,000 godly ways, but I've mastered 70 to 80%. After Chiyu created them, I also tried to integrate them. The Grand World Cultivation Method was created by the Snake Goddess, which attributed the creation of life and people to her. Before Chiyu's creation of the 3,000 godly ways, people generally practiced some kind of energy to the extreme and used it to create their inner worlds. At that time, Chiyu strove to merge all the energy in the source world in order to pursue the godly ways great unity. However, the different types of energy weren't arranged under categories. With his wit and remarkable talent, Chiyu managed to gather all of them and listed 3,000 godly ways. These godly ways were classified according to subject, which enthused people everywhere to integrate them. Those born in ancient times sought the truth theurgies and tried to integrate the godly ways. However, they found out that this did not work. Fuxi laughed now, but he was most probably crazy for it back then, judging from his strong thirst for the truth theurgy. Among the 3,000 godly ways Chiyu created, Fuxi was able to master 630. Moreover, according to what he said, about 300 godly ways were essentially same as others. The parting water godly way and the mysterious ice godly way, for example, were different in energy performance but derived from the same energy. Fuxi worked really hard but got nothing in the end when he failed to gather all the energy. To say he was disappointed was an understatement. Thus, he began to laugh at those who tried to do the same thing. It was impossible to combine the 3,000 godly ways and transform them into the energy of the godly ways' great unity as far as he was concerned. When he saw Zen having absorbed several hundred godly ways, Fuxi couldn't help himself and teased the young man. Zen, of course, had no idea of all this or what was going through Fuxi's mind. I choose the emotion-closing godly way, he told him. He had previously used the spiritual darkness to refine his godly tile, but he hadn't really made any progress in exploring the godly ways. Now that he was slated to return to the divine land, he was eager to improve his cultivation by breaking through a godly way. Fuxi nodded at his answer. Okay, he had explored Zen's inner world just now and found the young man's main part of the godly tile to be the emotion-closing godly way. Zen's choice didn't really come as a surprise for him. With a gentle pat, a grayish-white sheet appeared over their heads. Zen looked up and saw huge 8 diagrams on the sheet along with countless gray and white lights. There was a mysterious aura that emanated from it as it spun. What's this? He asked curiously. This is the 8 diagrams chart, Fuxi answered smugly. The fact that Fuxi possessed 8 ancient treasures was already well known. The Dragon River painting, the 9 halls diagram, the cyan divination herb, the phoenix zither, the demon's refining calabash, the 8 diagrams chart, the heaven and earth dagger, and the book of longevity. Each treasure was enough to attract the attention and interest of countless masters on its own. What's the use? Zen asked. You'll know in a minute, Fuxi answered before pointing his finger upwards. The 8 diagrams chart suddenly moved and enveloped Zen entirely. As the sheet covered him, Zen felt his entire body tremble. His soul had been cut off from all perception and he found himself falling into a monochrome world. The sight of a dumbstruck Zen made Fuxi smile. You are lucky to have me use the 8 diagrams chart to help you break through. As soon as he said this, Fuxi immediately fell into a trance and closed his emotions. He pressed his index and middle fingers together before lightly snapping towards the 8 diagrams chart. Whoosh! A burst of sword energy immediately flew towards it. After that, Fuxi took a few steps back and leaned onto the tombstone. There was a reason why he willingly helped this young man. Zen had been chosen by Othniel as an agent and would no doubt make a difference in the future. Although Fuxi did not have the ability to see the future, he could make a few assumptions. He had sworn himself to be the finale hero, and for that, he paid a huge price. Zen might very well prove to be an asset and help him in the future. Meanwhile, Zen was floating in that gray and white world. Inside this strange place, Zen realized that all his thoughts had slowed down. The 8 diagrams chart continued to lazily rotate above him, making him feel sleepy. This environment felt very calming and he felt as if he could think more clearly here. What a strange feeling. If I cultivate under such a state, I will most probably make rapid progress. This magic weapon of Fuxi is pretty good. Zen did not really know the origins of this 8 diagrams chart, but it must be of great value. The serene, peaceful state was broken, however, upon the arrival of a disturbance above him. This disturbance came in the form of sword energy and Zen's eyes flashed as he caught sight of it. The sword energy is amazing. The emotion-closing godly way contained in it is so pure. I can't see through it. Although he had made great attainments in the emotion-closing godly way, he still hadn't reached the level of a consummate true god. The emotion-closing godly way within the sword energy in front of him was extremely mysterious. There was no way Zen could see through it. It also moved very slowly. The moment the sword energy burst through the 8 diagrams chart, it split into 2 rays. Upon a second collision, it further split into 4 and continued on and on. The emotion-closing godly way gets weaker with each collision. A glint flashed in Zen's eyes. 4 rays, 8 rays, 16 rays. Zen raised his eyebrows when the sword energy reached 128 rays. The ripping consciousness. At that point, Zen could finally see the emotion-closing godly way within the sword energy. Just as he figured it out, the 128 rays began to merge once again. Chapter 2256, Nothingness in 1. The rays of sword energy merged at a very slow speed like when they got split just now. There were 128 rays of sword energy which merged into 64 rays. In addition, the emotion closing godly way contained in them became stronger. Lastly, the mysteries of the emotion closing godly way finally revealed themselves during the fusion process. I got it. This 8 diagrams chart can continuously decompose the emotion closing godly way and reveal its innermost essence to me. What an ingenious method. Yet, Zen thought that it still couldn't compare to the Infinity Ruler. After all, the Infinity Ruler could hold all the energies that belong to the 3000 godly ways. It was only that Zen's cultivation was limited, so he could not fully display them. According to what Fuxi and the Chaos Ancient God had said, it wouldn't work to merge the godly ways. Despite that, Zen refused to give up. Chiyu had passed down the Infinity Ruler to his mother, Lorena, who then gave it to his father, Mike, who had lastly chosen to give it to him, Zen. There must be a reason why such a thing happened. Besides, even if he couldn't make it in the end, the power of the way's blending energy alone would be of great help to him at this current time. Thus, he had no reason to give up. After he thought about it for a while, he stared at the sword energy intently and concentrated on comprehending it. Meanwhile, things had changed on the other side. The people of the Warden race had retreated to one side of the equality altar. Since Fuxi had spoken, the powerful warriors at the other shore realm present didn't make things difficult for them anymore. Anyway, all they wanted to do was leave. As long as the Warden race didn't stop them, then they would have nothing more to worry about. As for the Warden race, they were now aware that the situation was hopeless. They would only bring about their own destruction if they persisted. Moreover, Fuxi had already told them that even Herbert had given up. From there, it proved that the Free faction was right, and it was indeed unnecessary for the conservative faction to push through. Just then, the leader of the Warden race slowly approached Luther and unwrapped the bag on his back. The bag contained 13 blue short swords. There were only a few people in the Warden race who were qualified to use those short swords, and Luther was one of them. He held a short sword in one hand and turned around. He nodded at Emily, then said, "Master. I'm ready." A faint smile tugged at the corners of Emily's lips. She restrained her excitement, grabbed Luther, and disappeared. She searched all the way through the curse chain behind her and soon arrived at the top of a high platform. The curse chain that bound Emily was tied to this high platform. After a while, Luther didn't hesitate too much and proceeded to extract the life vitality in his body and poured it into the short sword. As the blue light on the surface of the short sword glowed increasingly brighter, he brandished the blade and slashed at the curse chain. Ding! There was a small, ringing sound. Then, the short sword cut a small, golden bug into pieces. The curse chain seemed to be formed from numerous golden bugs that were connected to each other. Yet, that was only what it looked like. In fact, the entire chain behind Emily was only a bug. When Luther shattered that one bug, he had shattered all of the other bugs, which meant that the entire curse chain broke into pieces at the same time. Finally, "It's now broken," Emily exclaimed in relief. She had been once so desperate, that she thought that she could never leave this world. This world had shackled her for too long. Up until now, she still didn't know Herbert's purpose. Even Fuxi didn't give a complete explanation. However, those things didn't matter now. The important thing was that she could leave and go back to the source world. "Thank you, Luther," Emily said lightly. She was now visibly relaxed. Even though the space was narrow, she still felt free as a bird that flew high in the sky. "You are my master. It's what I should do for you." He chuckled. "All the disciples of our Rose sector female. You'd be the only exception if we accept you," she said with pursed lips. She had originally refused to admit him as her disciple, and did not intend to accept him. She had only taught him to help him become a true god in the quickest time possible. Now, she was in a good mood and thus decided to announce that she had formally accepted him as her disciple. After Emily finished speaking, she grabbed Luther and disappeared from the high platform. They both returned to the equality altar. Next, it was Timotheus' turn to take Luther to search for the cursed chain that bound him. The other exiles from different races looked anxious as they waited for their turns. Although they also knew that their turn would come sooner or later, it was such an important thing to them. How could they possibly restrain their eagerness? The cursed chains of the exiles present had been cut off by Luther. Next, it was the wild gods' turns. About half a day later, the cursed chains that bound everyone present had been broken. "Now, there's only Zen left," said Emily as she gazed at the hill. However, Timotheus looked worried. "I don't know what Zen is doing. He hasn't returned yet," he muttered. Although Emily didn't think that Fuxi would hurt Zen, no one actually knew what crazy thing he could do since he had been trapped for so long. Let's wait a bit more, she answered. She didn't dare to disturb them. On the other hand, the rays of sword energy continued to merge in the 8 diagrams chart. The 128 rays of sword energy that had merged into 64 now fused to 32. Zen continued to deduce as the sword energy merged some more. The 64 streams of sword energy still contain ripping consciousness, but the state of forgetting myself is much more advanced. Forgetting myself. In the 32 streams of sword energy, I can feel something that has surpassed the notion of the state of forgetting myself. Quote, it was like a circular cycle. The streams of sword energy continued to merge and split over and over. At that point, the thoughts in his mind became much clearer. When those streams of sword energy finally merged into one, a strange light suddenly flashed in Zen's eyes. In essence, the ripping consciousness is still to negate the self-consciousness. But in subconsciousness, one still can't get rid of their own consciousness. The streams of sword energy ranging from the 64th stream of sword energy to the 16th stream of sword energy form the formless state. While the streams of sword energy ranging from the 8th stream of sword energy to the last one form the state of nothingness in one. In essence, the emotion-closing godly way is a kind of virtual energy. Swish! It was at that moment when Zen clearly saw what the sword energy had revealed. Furthermore, his understanding of the emotion-closing godly way had broken several bottlenecks in a row. Buzz! Such an amount of enlightenment caused him to fall into some kind of magical state. In addition, the golden light that surrounded his soul was now quite dazzling. Still, he did not forget himself nor did he turn into an emotionless, statue-like being. He was simply in a state of nothingness. When Fuxi saw Zen who was in such a state, his eyes twitched slightly as he leaned more on the tombstone. It was true that Zen had help from the 8 diagrams chart, but the speed of Zen's comprehension of the emotion-closing godly way still surprised him a little. Chapter 2257, Breakthrough. Fuxi wasn't someone who could get shocked easily. The Divine Land, after all, was just a world created in the chaos by Chiyu. The source world remained as the main world of the whole chaos. There were just too many amazingly powerful people who had done unbelievable things there since ancient times. Fuxi pressed on the 8 diagrams chart with his finger. The sheet that had formerly covered Zen's head suddenly returned to his hand. With the sheet no more, Zen slowly opened his eyes and turned to Fuxi. He had just comprehended the emotion-closing godly way, but he wasn't about to leave just yet. Instead, Zen chose to remain cross-legged by Fuxi's side. His incarnation was currently condensing in his inner world. Below the continent of Zen's inner world, tens of thousands of spiritual darknesses shuttled through numerous, small, weaving caves. These spiritual darknesses had grown in number and were now divided into different forces. Occasionally, they would even fight each other for territory. Zen's arrival did not attract the attention of anyone in his inner world. However, as a thought came to his mind, a force suddenly grasped the spiritual darknesses. They were suddenly pulled out of the complicated caves they resided in and unceremoniously thrown into the chaotic sea. Plop, plop, plop. As soon as they hit the brown water, it immediately began to boil. Huge clouds then rose from the surface of the sea. Zen stared at these clouds and his entire temperament suddenly changed. He had already cut off all his emotions since he was in the state of ripping consciousness. His eyes might look energetic, but there was no vigor in them. He was like a stone carving, or perhaps a frozen iceberg that had been submerged under the still oceans for thousands of years. With the change of his consciousness, the brown clouds began to emanate the aura of the emotion-closing godly way, turning into sword clouds. These sword clouds were infinitely fiercer than the ones Zen had made before. Once the spiritual darknesses turned into sword clouds, Zen would then be able to use them in condensing his godly tile. He was previously trapped in his own comprehension of the emotion-closing godly way, which prevented him from reaching the consummate level. However, the situation was now different. "It's not enough," he exclaimed. There was an evident frown on his face and the light in his eyes once again shone. Formless state. His aura changed once again. Zen had now lost any form at this point. Nothingness in one. His aura surged in strength before gradually becoming weaker until it faded away. At that moment, he had completely comprehended the state of nothingness in one. The world no longer existed for Zen, and to the world, Zen also did not exist. As his aura changed, so did the momentum from the sword clouds. The force that burst out had now actually doubled. The amount of the sword momentum was dozens of times higher than when Zen was in the ripping consciousness state. Countless sword shadows circled the clouds as if a hidden sword kingdom hid there. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. An idea flashed through his mind and all the clouds rolled towards the godly tile and entered. Without the infinity ruler, Zen could keep on comprehending the emotion-closing godly way, use the spiritual darknesses to wash his godly tile and help him reach the higher cultivation base. Ever since Zen activated the infinity ruler, he absorbed way too many godly ways and was led astray to some extent. He had gotten absorbed in blending the godly ways which led to the slow progress in his cultivation base. Now everything was back on track. This was also one of the reasons why Mike arranged for him to cultivate the emotion-closing godly way. He needed to rely on a main part of the godly tile in order to become a consummate true god. As Zen concentrated on flushing the godly tile, he felt a sudden space fluctuation by his side. A figure suddenly appeared. The sight of this figure made him raise his eyebrows. Evil god. After leaving the divine land, Zen had gotten too caught up with his affairs to take care of the people in his inner world. He could not help but look at evil god in surprise. You have proved the godly way. Creator, the evil god muttered as he bowed to Zen. His stance indicated respect, but there was a noticeable gloom on his face. My 2 grandsons and I have become true gods. Moreover, I have comprehended all the godly ways arranged by you. However, my cultivation base is limited, and I can only comprehend 20 to 30% of them. There was a noticeable sadness in his tone. Zen had promised to let him be free but ended up disappearing for countless years. You've comprehended hundreds of godly ways. Zen repeated in shock. He had initially absorbed hundreds of godly ways by means of the infinity ruler but never expected the evil god to comprehend them. Zen was indeed impressed by his talent. However, this did not mean that Zen's comprehension was inferior. After all, the gap in the time flow rate was huge between the two places. Zen had only spent a few years in the prison created by the chaos ancient god after leaving the divine land. The time flow rate within his inner world was much faster. The evil god was incomparably strong and invincible in the inner world. He also spent most of his time focusing on cultivation. Thus, his cultivation speed was much faster. Yes, the evil god affirmed. Creator, when will you let me go out of this world? Zen gave him a faint smile. I have had a lot to deal with these past few years and have not given you a chance to go out. It won't be too long now though. He had no intention of explaining the divine land and the outside world to the evil god right now. It would be quite difficult for the evil god to understand the structure of the outside world by mere description. He would only be able to do so after he entered the divine land. Fortunately, Zen's reply was enough to satisfy the evil god. He could really do nothing else but wait. He had already waited for so long, so what was a few more years? During their conversation, the sword clouds had already merged into Zen's godly tile. Rumble. There was a thunderous sound that came from afar. It was then that a sharp light burst out from the godly tile and soared into the sky. The evil god was clever and immediately realized that Zen had just made a breakthrough in his cultivation base. He cupped his hands and bowed. Congratulations, Creator. Your cultivation base has reached a new level. Only when Zen's own cultivation was promoted could the creatures in his inner world also be qualified to reach a higher level. Seeing his creator prosper filled the evil god with joy, and perhaps it could be said that he was even happier than Zen himself. Chapter 2258, Start the Journey. The evil god was restrained by his very own cultivation base. Although he had dabbled in such godly ways, he could only ever manage to master 20 to 30% of each of them because he was a low-ranked true god. Now that Zen had broken through as a consummate true god, the evil god could also just as likely improve his cultivation base and comprehend more godly ways. Surprise came over Zen. He had learned quite a lot from Fuxie's 8 diagrams chart. If he hadn't, it would have taken much more time before he could become a consummate true god. But the most important fact remained: Zen was unique amongst the other consummate true gods. With the infinity ruler's help, Zen managed to quickly absorb nearly all the godly ways he had witnessed with his own eyes. Once fully absorbed, they were wholly owned. Similar to the evil god's situation, his cultivation base was also limited in the past. Now that he had become a consummate true god, he could also use the consummate level of the other godly ways. When the light shooting up into the sky slowly dissipated, his godly tile began spinning slowly as his inner world rapidly expanded. As more continents rose out of the chaotic sea, the water seemed to broaden tenfold, the distance between the Sanskrit words constraining his inner world also expanded. Soon after the scene, Zen slowly opened his eyes. Still sitting cross-legged, he extended his arm and a long sword appeared in his grasp. Zen wouldn't dream of taking out his shadow-bearing sword in front of Fuxie. Although the latter showed no hostility and had even helped him break through, Zen couldn't bring himself to trust Fuxi so soon. Buzz. With a slight shake of the long sword, a wisp of sword intent slowly spiraled up the blade. Simultaneously, Zen was once again immersed in the state of nothingness in one. His sword was producing some kind of matchless energy. Just as Zen was about to slice through the air, a finger stopped the sword. This finger acted as a black hole. As soon as it touched the sword, the built-up energy had vanished without a trace. "Don't destroy my mountain," Fuxi simply said. Zen had intended to use his sword to test the power of the consummation level of the emotion-closing godly way. When Fuxi stopped him, he smiled. And then Zen stood up to lightly bow to Fuxi. "Thank you for your help. I'm deeply grateful." But Fuxi seemed down for some reason. With a wave of his hand, he leaned against the tombstone and closed his eyes shut. Not wanting to stay any longer, after expressing his gratitude, Zen turned to leave. It wasn't until Zen had rushed off that Fuxi opened his eyes to take a peek at the figure vanishing in the distance. He has inherited Chiyu's 3,000 godly ways and opened up the 1,000 Sanskrit land. Now, he's been chosen by a chaos ancient god. I wonder what Chiyu is feeling if he does know about it. With his broad vision, Fuxi could pick up several clues in a single glance. But he wasn't particularly interested in questioning the details any further, and Zen wasn't willing to tell him, anyway. He was well aware of Zen's origins and had figured out that Zen was an important asset to the Nine Li race. After all, very few members of the great races in the source world could dream of opening up the 1,000 Sanskrit land. In the distance, Zen climbed over the low mountain and returned to the equality altar. Many exiles were waiting for him there. Zen, when Timotheus, Ramsey and the others saw a figure arrive, their eyes lit up. "Did Fuxi cause you any trouble?" Timotheus asked in concern. Their greatest worry, of course, was Zen's safety. So long as he was all right, they figured everything would turn out fine. But if something happened to Zen, they had no other way to deal with Fuxi. "You've become a consummate true god." Ramsey's eyes lit up. With a smile, Zen nodded. "Yes, Master Fuxi has helped me a lot. Without the help of the 8 diagrams chart, Zen would have needed to explore the emotion-closing godly way little by little. Reaching the consummation of true god realm would have seemed far out of sight and reach." "Congratulations, Zen. Luther will help you cut off the curse chain," Emily said with a smile nearby. Luther stepped out alongside her with a short sword in his hand. When he cut off Zen's curse chain, all those lucky enough to have stepped into this space sighed in relief. But the world didn't consist of only the people there was also quite a number of wild gods. It was a huge project that cost much time cutting off the curse chains of hundreds of thousands of people. But they were the descendants of exiles, with exiles' blood flowing through their bodies, they wouldn't be left behind. After Zen was cut loose, he and the others returned to the Bone Tower first. Each great race left 1 or 2 exiles behind to help Luther cut off the curse chains. A few days later at the foot of the Sky Spirit Bone Tower, several exiles of the fire-melting race came to say goodbye. After situating over 10,000 wild gods of their race into their inner worlds, they flew deep into the sky. The chaos was too vast for anyone to even imagine. Even the powerhouses at the other shore realm found that it would be a long and difficult path to tread as they returned to the source world. But it didn't matter, everyone was eager to return as soon as possible. The fire-melting race was followed by the Star Deer race, the mysterious Oni race, etc. Not all the wild gods chose to leave. Some of them were born and raised in this world. They did not want to leave with their races, exiles. Though well aware that they'd soon face a difficult time without the exiles protecting them, they stubbornly refused to leave. And so the exiles didn't force them to come along. A month later, swish, a ray of sword radiance which was 10,000 feet long shot from the shadow-bearing sword. When the sword radiance was released, its power had covered hundreds of miles outward. There was a certain decisive power from this radiance, as though it could cut everything between heaven and earth. Clap, the sword radiance rushed forward rapidly and cut through the back of the Sky Spirit Bone Tower. In spite of the radiance being extremely sharp, it was still unable to leave any trace on the Bone Tower. But Zen was quite satisfied with the strike. "After I achieved the consummation of the emotion-closing godly way, this sword strike has become 5 times more powerful than the ways blending strike. In this case, I'm sure the power of the ways blending strike can be increased even further. I can't use it now, unfortunately." After Zen's cultivation base was improved, he had to merge the energy once again because it wasn't yet perfect. At the time, Zen hadn't yet been able to employ the Thurgies at the consummation level of other godly ways. Over the past month, Zen had continuously made progress in his sword strike. Meanwhile, he had been using the truth of cultivation nature to re-merge the godly ways. But combining the consummation level thurgies into one was undoubtedly a much more difficult task. Doing so would take a long time. Just then, Zen saw several beams of light suddenly flash in the sky. They came rapidly from a distance, the one in the lead pulling a long, colorful ribbon of light. Zen's eyes lit up at the sight. The snake goddess race was also ready. Emily had already agreed to go into the divine land with Timotheus and the others to assist him. At long last, it was finally time for their journey to begin. Chapter 2259, The Heavenly Mirror Shield. In the Sky Spirit Bone Tower, ahead of the long queue of the 9 Li race's wild gods, there was an oval-shaped transmission door. This transmission door led to Timotheus's inner world. Timotheus had already created a separate continent in his inner world. And on that continent, he had created a huge bone tower. After all, it was not easy for these wild gods to leave the bone tower, so he wanted to protect their emotions and put them at ease as much as possible. Even so, there were still many wild gods who chose to stay. These wild gods were standing on the other side of the cave, silently watching the great migration of their people with a myriad of emotions on their faces. The bad news was that with the departure of the exiles, the wild gods would lose their main source of protection. But on the bright side, the exiles of the other races were also leaving. This meant that the remaining wild gods, with their bloodlines, would still be qualified to dominate this world. Most of the wild gods had already entered Timotheus' inner world, and the exiles were saying goodbye to the rest of the wild gods who had chosen to stay behind. After all, the exiles and their race members had a deep relationship. Before they left, the exiles gave the wild gods a lot of extremely powerful magic weapons and left behind a large number of cultivation resources. Once it was all over, the remaining wild gods left the Sky Spirit Bone Tower and gathered with Emily and the others. Back when the exiles had just cut off their curses, Emily and Timotheus had warned all of them not to think about taking that ship. Naturally, the exiles had listened to Emily and Timotheus. Besides, the ship had originally been under the control of the snake goddess race. At this moment, Zen, Timotheus, and Leopold all looked toward the north, where the Torrent Bone Tower was located. Even from a long distance, they could see a faint yellow light floating in the sky. That tiny dot was the divine land. Although it was barely visible to the naked eye, it filled Zen with a sense of excitement. He had been longing for the day he could finally return to the divine land. On the other hand, Timotheus, Leopold, and the others had complicated emotions. As members of the 9 Li race, they were astonished and unable to accept the fact that their race had been defeated and destroyed by the Yellow Emperor. Now, the divine land was their only hope, so they had to support Zen and do their best for their race. "Let's go," said Emily lightly. The exiles of the 2 big races led Zen down to the Torrent Bone Tower after performing the grand teleportation technique several times. At the top of the Torrent Bone Tower, a ribbon of blood-red light extended upward, firmly binding the divine land. "After we arrive at the divine land, I'll release the shadow of Snake Goddess," said Emily. The ribbon of light was formed by the shadow of Snake Goddess. They hadn't released the shadow yet because Zen had repaired the power of the divine land. Once this ribbon of blood-red light was unfastened, the divine land, with no force to bind it any longer, would fly upward, leaving the bottom of the chaos. If that happened, it wouldn't be easy to get it back. Without exchanging too many words, everyone began to move upward with the grand teleportation technique. This bone tower was trillions of feet high. It would take years for Zen and some of the others to climb it on their own. But with the help of the masters at the other shore realm, they reached the top of the bone tower in a few hours. The divine land, which, from a distance, had been the size of an egg, now looked very large. It was like a giant gem that stood out in the sky, emitting a beautiful aura of magic. But the group didn't stop there. They passed the top of the Torrent Bone Tower and continued to move through space, shuttling, moving, and shuttling. A few days later, they arrived at the left side of the divine land. Compared to the vast divine land, their bodies were smaller than specks of dust. Emily and the others were shocked when they faced the giant land at such a close range. It was made by the Lord of Weapons. What a great ship, Emily couldn't help marveling out loud. When Timotheus, Leopold, and the others heard this, a triumphant expression appeared on their faces. The mighty warriors of the Source World all had their own methods and contributions, but it was clear that Chiyu deserved his title of Lord of Weapons. This ship was the last hope of the 9 Li race. Presumably, it would have taken Chiyu a lot of effort to create the divine land in the chaos. Grand Chieftain's work is marvelous, of course, Timotheus said with an excited laugh. Let's go in. Then, he took a step forward in midair and prepared to perform the grand teleportation technique so that he could move into the void and enter the divine land. But just as he slid into the void, there was a muffled bang. The next moment, he was flung out of the void, and his face was full of astonishment. An unreadable expression flashed through Emily's eyes when she saw this scene. Does this ship have a space barrier that seals it off from the surrounding space? Timotheus, who looked embarrassed, smoothed his beard and said, perhaps. Grand Chieftain would have definitely put some protective measures in place. How could this be? It was all right when I left. A strange look flashed in Zen's eyes. He had been directly sent out of the divine land by his mother. But at that time, he had not encountered any space barrier. Ramsey cast an indifferent look at Zen and said, you belong to the divine land, so it's easy for you to get in and out of it. However, the rest of us are naturally excluded by the divine land. There's still something wrong, Zen uttered, shaking his head. If that was the case, why can those yellow emperor guards enter the divine land? With a faint smile on her face, Emily tapped the tip of her toe and floated forward. They must have spent a great deal of effort in figuring out how to enter the divine land. Perhaps they found a method to destroy the outer wall of the divine land. As she spoke these words, a fierceness filled her eyes and several colorful spots of light flashed between her pale fingers. Each colorful spot of light contained an extremely terrifying amount of energy. They whirled around, producing a cone-shaped spiral. Go! With a slight flick of her slender finger, Emily shot the cone-shaped spiral toward the outer wall of the divine land. Buzz! Bang! The cone-shaped spiral spun fast against the outer wall of the divine land before it exploded, emitting a dazzling ball of light that everyone watched with bated breath. But soon, the ball of light faded off without a trace, and the expressions of the warriors at the other shore realm changed drastically. The outer wall of the divine land was still emitting a faint yellow light, and in the middle of the light loomed a triangular shadow that seemed to be the shield. With the protection of this shield shadow, the outer wall of the divine land had stood firmly against Emily's powerful attack. A bitter smile appeared on Emily's face. The work of the Lord of Weapons is too extraordinary. Emily was the strongest among these warriors at the other shore realm. If even she was unable to break through the outer wall of the divine land, it would be impossible for the rest of them. Their expressions froze in disbelief. It's the heavenly mirror shield. I didn't expect Grand Chieftain to integrate it into the divine land. We're in trouble now, said Leopold, frowning as he looked at the fading shield shadow. Chapter 2260, Chiyu's Efforts. The heavenly mirror shield was not made nor created by Chiyu, but was rather obtained by him from the ancient relic. Chiyu rarely used the shield ever since he became the Lord of Weapons. It was the reason why he handed it over to Kaden. Ramsey had seen Kaden use the heavenly mirror shield before. The moment he recognized the triangular shadow of the shield, it had confirmed his thought. The heavenly mirror shield can cover even the heaven and earth with the formless power. It is not easy to break it, Leopold uttered. What Leopold said made Timotheus raise his eyebrows slightly. He spoke, let me have a try. Everyone, step back. Ramsey put his hand on Zen's shoulder, and all the other shore realm warriors quickly retreated. After Timotheus was given space, he opened his palms and a golden broadsword appeared. Grow. As soon as he gave out the order, his figure began to grow and swell. It didn't take much time before he turned into a giant of millions of feet tall in an instant. He carried the broadsword on his shoulder, his white hair and long beard were fluttering. As his aura spread out, it gave off such a huge pressure. Ramsey waved his hand and helped Zen block that aura. Otherwise, Zen would have been inflicted and injured under this aura. Timotheus let out a shout, holding the golden broadsword. The broadsword was slashed out, then followed by thin line appearing. The seemingly unremarkable strike contained an extremely mysterious truth of godly way. That thin line contained certain energy of the chaos. So powerful, Zen took a secret glance at Emily beside him. After Zen fell into the world below, he had never seen Emily and Timotheus employ their real strength. He had no idea about their true ability. After all, the exiles of the Snake Goddess race, the Nine Li race and the Yellow Emperor race never had an encounter fighting against each other. He saw how Emily had easily defeated all the exiles in the space where the Warden race lived. And afterwards, everyone was suppressed by the strength-equalizing Thurgi. Through these circumstances, they still didn't have the chance to display their full strength. Now that he was looking at the sight of Timotheus's terrible strike, he was shocked with fear. When the thin line created by the broadsword touched the outer wall of the divine land, a triangular shield shadow appeared for the second time. However, this shield shadow was countless times larger than the previous one. Crack! A deep muffled sound was heard in the air. Just then, the thin line which was created by the broadsword had collided with the outer wall of the divine land. The collision was exactly the same as the attack Emily had launched. There was no trace left on it. Leopold let out a breath. The defenses of the divine land are not a threat to us. What's troublesome is the heavenly mirror shield. After Emily and Timotheus had a try, they finally stopped the idea of destroying the wall violently. But they knew they had to enter the divine land. Ramsay, several other shore realm warriors of the snake goddess race, and the others had also tried using their own techniques. In order to break the space barrier which blocked the grand teleportation, Ramsay made use of the space-breaking rune. Other shore realm warrior of the snake goddess race burst out the poisonous liquid to corrode the heavenly mirror shield but was unsuccessful in the end. No matter what kind of method and strategy they used, the end result was still a failure. For now, they were at a loss on what to do. I didn't expect that we wouldn't even be able to get in a ship, an exile of the Nine Li race said and bitterly laughed. You can't say that. After all, this ship is too important to our Nine Li race. Even the heavenly mirror shield can be integrated into this ship. I think Grand Chieftain has bet everything on this ship, Timotheus said in a low voice. Timotheus had once doubted a little about Zen's words. He didn't believe that the powerful Nine Li race was destroyed, and that the Grand Chieftain who was so formidable was defeated. Now that he stood in front of the divine land, the last doubt in his heart disappeared. If the Grand Chieftain was not in the bad situation, he wouldn't have had the reason to put all of his energy into building such a ship, the divine land. Everyone, have a rest. Since those yellow emperor guards have a way to enter, we can also find a way. Emily smiled faintly and urged everyone to take a rest. They were not discouraged. The divine land was so large. They didn't believe that a single heavenly mirror shield would be able to protect it all the time, and they thought they would be able to find out a way to enter it. There must be a way they could, in time, break through it. Emily turned to look at Zen and asked, Zen, do you know what weakness the divine land has? The weakness. Emily's question made him be lost in thought. In fact, he didn't know much about the divine land. He had been there before but wasn't able to explore further. He didn't have the chance to see the entire place. He thought deeper. In the sun, he had indeed observed the entire divine land at a special viewing angle. Not long after, Zen's eyes lit up at a sudden realization. Up there, Zen's gaze turned up towards the outer wall of the divine land. The top, what's on it? Leopold asked curiously following Zen's gaze. Now that the divine land has merged with the heavenly mirror shield, I'm afraid that the entire divine land would be under the protection of the heavenly mirror shield. Is there any weakness on the top of the divine land? The universes built by the holy beings are right above. Perhaps we can enter the divine land through those universes, Zen suggested. He was not completely sure, but he believed that it was better than nothing. Emily nodded and urged, let's go up to have a look. After discussing, these other shore realm warriors led the crowd to move up again. A day had already passed. They finally arrived at the top of the divine land. Compared to the bottom and both sides of the divine land, the top of the divine land was not flat. Right in the center at the top, there were many huge protuberant items. It was as if many huge balls were buried in the divine land and only small parts of the balls were exposed. What are these? Emily had a strange expression on her face. Universes, Zen simply stated. What is the universe? Timotheus asked in amazement. It's the holy being's inner world, Zen said with a puzzled look. These other shore realm warriors didn't even know this, so he could only explain. The top masters in the divine land attach the inner worlds to the divine land. Their strength is much stronger than those consummate true gods. Hearing Zen's explanation, some of the powerful other shore realm warriors were still confused. Emily seemed to have understood. She smiled and said, Lord of Weapons has really put a lot of effort into it. Such holy beings are even able to create the Lager inner worlds with the support of this ship, and they are more powerful than the consummate true gods. Those holy beings almost reach the other shore realm, right? Zen nodded. A holy being might not be as strong as Yellow Emperor guards, but they were much stronger than a consummate true god and not much weaker than an ordinary other shore realm warrior. More importantly, they had the ability of immortality. They would live forever and would not die as long as the universes still existed. They had more advantages compared to the other shore realm warriors. Just as they approached the protruding universes, Ramsay felt something strange in the distance. He slightly turned his head, pointed to the upper left side and asked, Look, what's that? Upon reaching the top of the divine land, they had already been completely freed from the prison below. They could see that above them was a large area of energy clouds formed by the chaotic energy. These chaotic clouds didn't look big in appearance, but in fact, each of them was as large as billions of divine lands. And at the tip of the tail of the chaotic cloud closest to the divine land, there was a cyan light dot that was rapidly moving. Behind the cyan light dot, there were a few black dots following closely.